Floyd and Katoya, they was inseparable. You see her, you see him. You see him, you see her. I got there, they had it taped off, and then I heard this girl say, well, they say it's 2 people in there. I just got numb. I just couldn't believe that this happened, and I still don't.
The maintenance worker noticed that the back sliding glass was completely shattered. They did not respond to him. Both were cold to the touch.
The issue came up of who was actually the owner of the car.
He thought they were doing him wrong, so he wanted to do them wrong.
There was a very strong sense of family. When one called for help, the others came.
He wanted revenge. He wanted payback.
I can't believe this just happened right in front of my eyes.
It's just after 11 a.m. on December 29th, 2020 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. A maintenance worker at the Oak Tree apartment complex makes his rounds for the day.
The maintenance worker was just kind of driving around, seeing if, it's just kind of just a once through the apartment, see if there's anything. And he noticed that the back sliding glass door of the apartment number 1 there was completely shattered out. Obviously, it concerned him very much because this was an occupied apartment. It was a very cold time of year. This was in December.
He contacted his supervisor, who authorized him to go in and make sure everything was okay.
So he went up to the apartment and kind of, as maintenance does, he calls out multiple times just to see, hey, is there anybody home? As he's walking into the apartment, he's just, still being very cautious, just calling out because he doesn't want to, surprise anybody. Just as soon as you're in that hallway, you can see that bedroom, and you could see legs. He was on the bed, and he was clearly unresponsive. He kind of backed out right away. He obviously had a feeling that something was very, very wrong. So that maintenance worker contacted the manager, said, hey, something's going on. Can you please call the police? So that the actual manager of the complex contacted the police department.
A patrol officer with the Kalamazoo Police Department responds. He enters the apartment and heads toward the bedroom.
As he got into the bedroom, he observed a man on the bed and a woman up against the wall.
He discovered that there were 2 deceased individuals inside.
They're cold to the touch. A male victim and a female victim.
There was blood and injuries to the subjects. It was apparent that the subjects had gunshot wounds.
They located the identifications of driver's licenses of the 2 decedents and were able to identify them as Katoya McPherson and Floyd Brasher Jr.
"36-year-old Floyd Brashers Jr. was a Kalamazoo native.
Floyd was a happy baby. He didn't cry much. He walked at age 9 months. Floyd was an A student. He was on the honor roll. He was in the gifted class. He was real smart. Floyd, he loved sports. He was on a basketball team, he was on the football team, and he was on the volleyball team. He played exceptional basketball, and they just knew, he was real good.
In his teens, Floyd had a brief romance with Katoya McPherson.
They've been knowing each other for quite some time. We was close. She used to call me Mom.
The youthful romance ended when Floyd moved to Georgia with his mother.
He met another young lady that he had a relationship with, and he married her. She was a sweetheart. She was really a sweet girl. I liked her a lot.
Floyd had to be at least about 18 when he had his first child. He was just ecstatic. He was very proud to be a father. Like I say, he was very excited when he had his little girl. And then his son, I guess that just was the highlight of his life.
But the youthful marriage ended.
For some reason, unknown to me, they decided to go their separate ways. However, Floyd continued to stay active in his daughter's life and his son's life. He came back to Kalamazoo somewhere between 2009 and 10. Him and Katoya got back together. He still had feelings for her. Perhaps she still had feelings for him as well.
They met up again, and he moved in with her, and he had told me, he said, she has a little girl now. And he was thrilled about that. She would call my son Dad. And so they were a happy little couple. I was happy for him.
They were like two peas in a pod. They loved each other.
The couple struggled financially, but Floyd always opened his home and sometimes his wallet to those in need.
Floyd was too trusting. When it came to loaning people money, helping people, just certain people just took advantage of his kindness.
But keeping Katoya happy was always his first priority.
He couldn't go nowhere without Katoya. When he was with her, she had to go everywhere he went.
In December 2020, the couple took a trip north to visit Floyd's father just after Christmas.
I went to pick up my son and Katoya, both from the bus station here in Kalamazoo. They had went up for the holiday to visit his dad. And when they got back here, I picked them up from the bus station and took them home.
But the day after they returned, responding officers with the Kalamazoo Police Department find the couple dead inside their apartment.
They tape off the area. They want to make sure they get the perimeter secured, and they call the other investigators to check out the scene.
Homicide detectives arrive.
When detectives first checked the bedroom in which the victims were located, it appeared to be the main bedroom. Had the full-size bed and a TV in it. Laying face down on the bed was Mr. Brashers, and Miss McPherson was located, slumped up against the wall, just below the window. When looking at them, they were wearing what I would describe as clothes to sleep in. The fact that they were both in the bedroom, to me, seems like they were in the bedroom when whoever entered into the apartment.
They see that there's 7 shell casings around from a .32 caliber gun.
It appeared that once the victims were shot, where they fell is where they stayed.
Floyd Brasher was shot 5 times and Katoya McPherson was shot twice.
When you go into an apartment and the residents are deceased, it can be very difficult to ascertain if there's anything missing. Because, we as investigators don't know necessarily what was there and what may be missing. So initially, I wouldn't say there was any sign of robbery.
It appears the only thing the intruder was after was Floyd and Katoya.
The sliding glass door was shattered, but that was just how the suspects entered the apartment. I did not see things overturned. Someone broke into the house, ran into the house, shot them in their bedroom, and fled. Just from that very basic description, it seems like this was very targeted. They shot and killed both subjects. It wasn't one of them, it was both of them.
Four days after Christmas 2020, investigators in Kalamazoo, Michigan are at an apartment where 36-year-old Floyd Brashers Jr. and 33-year-old Katoya McPherson were shot to death in their bedroom. With few clues to be found inside the apartment, detectives look for witnesses.
We eventually spoke with the neighbor who lived in the apartment next to the victims. That neighbor indicated that in the previous evening, they had heard 6 or 7 gunshots.
Another neighbor was talked to, and they said they heard shots as well, about 6 to 7.
Both neighbors say the gunshots rang out shortly after 7 p.m.
Several officers observed houses that had exterior cameras. One of those houses was to the east of the location, and the camera pointed directly at the back of the apartment. So officers made contact with the homeowner to see if they could obtain video surveillance from that particular camera.
As detectives continue to work the scene, Floyd's family gets word of police activity at his apartment.
I received a phone call from my nephew, and he was crying and upset. He was saying, "You need to go see what's going on over there at Floyd and Katoya's." I got there. I'm looking at the crime scene. They had it taped off. And then I heard this girl say, "Well, they say it's 2 people in there." And I'm like, oh no. You know, I'm thinking, well, Floyd and Katoya, they, like I say, they was inseparable. You see her, you see him. You see him, you see her. So now I'm in tears. And sure enough, one of the officers, he come back and he said to me, he said, "We identify the body." Yes, it is. It's your son.
Meanwhile, detectives get word on the security cameras.
The system was a little older, and the camera footage, especially at night, was not clear, but we were able to obtain the video footage.
They check it around the time witnesses reported hearing the gunshots.
At 7:13:25, the 2 subjects are shown walking towards the apartment complex.
You could clearly see 2 silhouettes that ran up to the apartment.
One was taller, one was shorter. You see those 2 individuals go to the slider back door. They do something to the back door. You can't tell what it is.
At 7:13:47, the same 2 subjects are shown going inside.
About 9 seconds later, you see them both come out, and this time they're running across that area between the slider back door, and they disappear into those woods.
Then, an officer on the scene approaches detectives.
Sergeant White was quite adamant in letting us know that, hey, I had responded here multiple times yesterday.
Katoya McPherson and Floyd Brashers called the police the day before at 8:45.
Mr. Brashers had indicated that there were 2 individuals that had staying with them, that they wanted them out.
They called to get 2 people removed, D'Angelo Davis and Marcus Nichols. Marcus and D'Angelo were homeless, so Katoya and Floyd agreed to let them stay over the weekend. But the victim stated that the 2 gentlemen had overstayed their welcome, and they refused to leave.
When patrol officers arrived, they found D'Angelo furious, but not over being asked to leave.
There was a disagreement between Floyd Brashers and D'Angelo Davis, specifically about a missing vehicle.
D'Angelo was upset because he said they were lying about where his car was. They said it had gotten towed.
D'Angelo didn't believe the car was towed. Floyd told the officer it didn't matter. He explained that Katoya's stepsister bought the car from Floyd, promising to make payments. But before she paid it off, she sold it to D'Angelo.
She had purchased this vehicle from Floyd Brasher's, and that she was in the process of selling it to D'Angelo Davis. He still owed a certain amount of money on the vehicle, and she was still owed money to Floyd Brasher's.
Therefore, according to Floyd, the vehicle was legally his. At the urging of the officers, Marcus and D'Angelo left.
Now at this point, Marcus and D'Angelo are totally upset and frazzled. They grab their belongings and they leave, and they're picked up by a female.
The driver of the vehicle was D'Angelo's sister, Tanisha, and they did end up leaving the apartment complex.
But a couple of hours later, the officer says he was called back to the apartment. D'Angelo was there again, demanding that Floyd turn over the vehicle.
It was then that Mr. Brasher's presented an out-of-state title and saying, it was his vehicle. He then started saying, well, I have the keys, but the vehicle is hidden. He didn't want to tell Mr. Davis where the vehicle was.
The officers tells Davis that, look, this is a civil situation. You're gonna have to take this to civil court. Now Davis is getting even more upset and more infuriated. He feels like this is totally unfair because this is his vehicle and it is mine. However, still, there's nothing anyone can do.
The officer reports that the two men left, but now detectives are wondering, did they come back a third time?
I feel that it would be prudent to obviously follow up with them because of how upset he was and the fact that now they're dead, the next day.
Investigators working the homicide of Michigan couple Floyd Brasher's Jr. and Katoya McPherson want to question D'Angelo Davis over a dispute he had with the couple about a car.
We did have a phone number for D'Angelo Davis, so I drafted a search warrant, which could tell us within a small geographic area where that phone was at the time. I started receiving active locations for Mr. Davis. Due to the severity of the crime, we were investigating a double murder, and the fact that Mr. Davis had previous firearm possession cases, it indicated that a more serious response was needed. It was determined that the Kalamazoo area Metro SWAT team would assist in arresting Mr. Davis. We were able to follow him for a short period of time and ended up making a stop on him on the east side of the city.
Almost a week after the shootings, D'Angelo Davis is taken into custody without incident.
After his arrest, he was taken to the Kalamazoo Township Police Department. The detective did ask him about what happened that day, or at least his whereabouts of that day. He stated that he had spent time with his family, specifically his sister Tanisha and his relative Trevor. We could verify some of that information because we knew for a fact that his sister had picked him up on the 28th.
Along with Marcus, D'Angelo says they left the apartment complex and tried to figure out where Floyd hid the car.
He had been driving around with the people in the car. Tanisha was driving the car, it's her vehicle, and they're driving around looking for the car.
But they couldn't find it.
Marcus was dropped off at his sister's residence, and from there, he claimed he spent the rest of the evening with his sister at his aunt's house.
Detective Sergeant Hayner did tell Mr. Davis that he in fact was a suspect in this case. And once he realized that he was a suspect in the case, requested an attorney. Due to the fact that Mr. Davis requested an attorney, Detective Sergeant Hayner no longer questioned him, and then he was transferred to the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department for his bond violation.
But D'Angelo doesn't remain in custody for long.
2 days later, D'Angelo Davis was released from jail.
With nothing else to go on, D'Angelo remains the only suspect. On January 7th, investigators reach out to Katoya's stepsister, Damania Johnson, the woman from whom D'Angelo said he bought the disputed car.
Damania told me that she had bought that car from Floyd. She had used the car and, she had sometimes driven D'Angelo Davis to work, but was in the process of selling that vehicle to D'Angelo Davis.
Their agreement was for D'Angelo to pay her $700.
When she first made the decision to sell the vehicle to D'Angelo, she said that she gave D'Angelo a ride and that his relative, Trevor, actually went with them. They went to the bank and Trevor's the actual one who took $500 out of the bank and gave it to her as like a down payment on the car. At the time of the incident, D'Angelo was 24 years old and Trevor was 17 years old. He also seemed to have a very strong influence on Trevor. She then said that D'Angelo also gave her several $100s as an additional payment on the car, but that he had still owed her some money on the car.
When D'Angelo stopped paying her, she stopped paying Floyd, prompting him to take back possession of the car the day before the shootings. She tells police D'Angelo was livid.
On the day before this incident occurred, he had called her multiple times to verify that he owned the vehicle. At that time, she didn't want to get involved, but he was messaging her multiple times. She could clearly tell that he was upset. And a big concern of hers was that he messaged her about, if they're going to put me through this, I'm going to be homeless.
He said if they don't give the car back, he would just be suffering. And he would make their life hell.
Kalamazoo detectives questioned Damania Johnson about murder suspect D'Angelo Davis. She tells investigators that he was furious over a botched car sale between himself and murder victims Floyd Brashers Jr. and Katoya McPherson.
She described him as kind of multiple terms, but a really good controlling person, manipulator, but also a mastermind. And going on with my interview with her, she said that D'Angelo and Trevor were very, very tight, and she had seen both of them with guns. We were understanding that there was possibly two suspects involved, Marcus Nichols O'Neal or D'Angelo Davis. So while they were persons of interest, this added an additional person of interest because she had brought up the fact that D'Angelo was very, very tight with his brother Trevor and that she had seen both of them with firearms previously. We decided we'd go and find Marcus Nichols O'Neal. We had several addresses for him, and after checking several addresses, we located him and asked him to come speak with us, and he voluntarily came to the Kalamazoo Township Police Department. We started talking to him about the incidents of that day. We knew that he was with D'Angelo in the morning, so we just began talking to him about the day, what he did, where he went, things like that.
He admits that he and D'Angelo did go back to the apartment for a third time, around 7 p.m.
In fact, he specifically said Tanisha drove him and D'Angelo Davis to the apartment complex.
He says they parked in the lot of another complex connected to the one where Floyd lived by way of a wooded path.
Marcus stated that they approached the home through the woods.
Then he talks about breaking in the back window.
He admits that he was the one that broke the window in Katoya and Floyd's home, but he can't remember what weapon he used. He didn't know if it was a bat or a rock or what.
He's going back and forth, but then later says it's a bat. He then describes going into the apartment. And this is where some of the information that someone with intimate knowledge of the crime would know.
He also correctly stated what kind of caliber gun was used in the shooting.
He knows the caliber of the firearm used, which, again, you would only know that a .32 caliber firearm was used. It's not a typical caliber.
But as he goes on, detectives note that Marcus starts to get hung up on the details.
We talked to him about where the victims were, and his statement was that he thought one of the victims was in the kitchen. Now, we know from the scene that nothing happened in the kitchen. And we start talking to him about how many gunshots were fired. He says 2. He sticks to that number. We know that's not accurate.
He later admitted that D'Angelo was the one that fired the gun during an argument with Katoya and Floyd.
He stated that after shooting them, they then fled the scene and were then picked up by Tanisha. He believed that D'Angelo discarded the firearm somewhere in the woods. He talks about how he's shocked and just so surprised about what happened. He said that D'Angelo told him they were going over there to just get the car or find out where the car was, so he didn't expect there to be such violence and to have, Katoya and Floyd killed.
But detectives are troubled by Marcus's confession.
We did have concerns because some of the statements did not line up with the evidence that we had and had established. But at the same time, the statements were of such detail that we couldn't just put those discrepancies aside.
There is one part of Marcus's statement that police want to look into right away.
Specifically that Tanisha had driven them to and from the scene. And we also knew Tanisha had picked D'Angelo up and returned him to the apartment earlier on the 28th when they were still determining ownership of the vehicle. So we knew for sure that made sense. So we went and found Tanisha at her place of employment. She said on the 28th, after picking up her brother, they had contacted multiple towing companies and couldn't find the vehicle. She said that she drove D'Angelo around town for quite some time in an attempt to find the vehicle.
But Tanisha says she never went back to the apartment with her brother that night. Detectives think she is lying.
She was reluctant to speak about the incident, obviously because she was talking about her family. We confronted her with the fact that we had information that she drove her brother to the scene. Once we confronted Tanisha about the fact we knew that she had driven D'Angelo to the scene, she started to admit to what she knew about that evening. When we talked to her about Marcus Nichols O'Neal, she said that they had dropped him off earlier in the night and that he was not involved, and that the only people in that vehicle were her, D'Angelo, and Trevor. She was very clear.
Homicide detectives in Kalamazoo, Michigan, are questioning Tanisha Taylor McMillan about the shooting deaths of Floyd Brashers Jr. and Katoya McPherson. Tanisha tells them that confessed accomplice Marcus Nichols O'Neal wasn't even there. Instead, it was her, D'Angelo, and their younger relative, Trevor.
She admits to driving D'Angelo Davis and Trevor Moore to an apartment complex near the victim's home.
Now, she was saying that she did not know at this point what they were planning on doing other than going over there. She did not say she saw a weapon or a firearm. She said that they took a bat that she keeps in her vehicle for personal protection.
According to Tanisha, Trevor and D'Angelo got out of the car and headed down the path toward Floyd's apartment.
It wasn't very long from how long it took from when they left the vehicle to when they came back. I think it was just a matter of minutes.
And she says when they got back that Mr. Davis made statements about emptying a clip. Davis immediately told her to get out of there. She believed that they were going there to get the car back and only found out that the two had been killed after the fact.
So when they asked Tanisha who does she think pulled the trigger, she stated D'Angelo because he had the temperament, the energy, and the excitement, and he had a motive to do it. According to Tanisha, the real motive for the killing was D'Angelo was upset and wanted payback.
Tanisha is arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Meanwhile, Marcus is released.
Marcus had a brief conversation with the officers, and they asked about his false claim of being there. And he said, you know what? I have no idea why. Sometimes my brain gives me false conclusions.
Through statements given to him by Trevor and D'Angelo, for some reason, put himself at the scene in Trevor's shoes. And that is why he had so many incorrect statements about the facts in the case.
But D'Angelo remains free.
Subsequent contacts with D'Angelo Davis occurred following the arrest of Tanisha, his sister. During these contacts, D'Angelo didn't openly admit to his involvement in the crime. However, he showed a great deal of concern and remorse that his sister had been caught up in the investigation. That seemed to be his singular focus.
On March 29, 2021, D'Angelo reaches out, wanting to take some of the heat off his sister, Tanisha.
D'Angelo stated that he came forward because his sister thought he abandoned her, and he wanted to show her that he would never do that. He told the detectives that he did it all. He had the bat, he broke into the window, he was the shooter. He did the entire thing himself.
He then changed that statement, and he told him next that Trevor had the baseball bat, but that he was the person who shot Floyd Brashers Jr. and Katoya McPherson.
Detectives were able to tell D'Angelo was lying. On the surveillance footage, it was shown that the taller of the two men were the one that actually broke the window and went in first. And as they compare the heights of the two individuals, D'Angelo was taller, so obviously he is the one that went in first.
So when confronted, D'Angelo Davis then changes his story, and he indicates that he had the baseball bat and that he's the one who broke out the slider, that when they entered, Trevor had the gun, and Trevor was the one who shot and killed both Katoya McPherson and Floyd Brashers.
D'Angelo hit Floyd in the legs so he could not get up. D'Angelo said Trevor shot Katoya first, then Floyd. He brought the bat back to his aunt's house and discarded it near a basketball court. Trevor sold the gun a few days later after the murders.
According to D'Angelo, the murders were about respect.
D'Angelo felt very disrespected by what happened to the vehicle. He thought they were doing him wrong, so he wanted to do them wrong.
D'Angelo Davis is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. 2 weeks later, Trevor Moore is found.
On April 19, 2021, I was notified that Trevor had been located in a nearby county and had been taken into custody on an unrelated incident.
When Trevor was asked, did he do the murder for the family ties, he said, the family ties ain't that strong. Then he concluded the interview.
He is charged with 2 counts of felony murder. One is for Katoya McPherson, and the other is for Floyd Brashers.
As the trials near, prosecutors approach Tanisha.
Ultimately, we made an offer to her that if she pled guilty to being an accessory after the fact to murder, that the other charges would be dismissed. The other part of the plea agreement is that she agreed as part of the agreement to testify truthfully in cases involving the death of the two decedents and DeAngelo Davis and Trevor.
But then DeAngelo's attorney reaches out. He also wants a deal.
DeAngelo was offered a plea deal of second-degree murder if he would have testified against Trevor Moore.
DeAngelo took the deal. However, that deal was dependent on him testifying during the trial.
In March 2022, Trevor Moore goes on trial for the 2020 shooting deaths of Floyd Brashers Jr. and Katoya McPherson.
At the time these murders happened, he was 17, and he ended up being tried as an adult. He was 18 during the time of the trial.
Two of his close relatives, DeAngelo Davis and Tanisha Taylor McMillan, have taken deals in exchange for their promise to testify against him. But at the start of the trial, DeAngelo has a change of heart.
I show up to trial the second day of trial, and that's when I'm informed by his attorney that he's going to assert his right to remain silent.
And that kind of disrupted the prosecutor's flow and theory of the trial, because they had talked a lot about what DeAngelo Davis was going to say during the trial.
DeAngelo's refusal to testify caused a mistrial in Trevor's case in March of 2022.
Having refused to testify against Trevor, in June of 2022, DeAngelo Davis must now go on trial himself.
When we went into that trial, his confession to the police was the cornerstone of the case.
Even though DeAngelo said Trevor was the triggerman, the prosecution paints him as the mastermind and the man with the motive.
Part of the argument that I made to the jury is, under Michigan law, there is aiding and abetting in a case. So I believe the evidence showed that DeAngelo Davis aided and abetted in the homicide.
The police officers testifying about the incident that happened the day before, DeAngelo being very upset, being forced off the property by the police. This was his deal. This was his problem he had with these people. This is something that started because of him.
He's the one that directed where the trio went that day. So he was, I believe, the driving force behind each of the two murders. There was a very strong sense of family between the three of them. So when one called for help, the others came. And I think that that was a dynamic at play on the 28th of December 2020, that DeAngelo called first Tanisha for help and then Trevor for help, and that no small part based on that family dynamic, they came to assist him.
DeAngelo got found guilty of first-degree murder, got sentenced to life in prison.
That September, Trevor goes on trial again. The defense has the advantage.
Tanisha did testify about the murders, and she did implicate both DeAngelo and Trevor.
But it isn't enough.
The jury found
April 23, 2018 began like any other spring afternoon in Toronto. The city was finally thawing after months of bitter cold. Along Yonge Street, people moved with the restless energy that always arrives after a Canadian winter loosens its grip. Office workers carried iced coffees instead of paper cups filled with steaming tea. Students laughed outside subway entrances. Elderly couples walked slowly beneath pale sunlight that reflected off glass towers and streetcar rails. Delivery drivers cursed under their breath at traffic lights that never seemed to change fast enough. Somewhere above the city, construction cranes groaned in the wind like giant metal skeletons stretching awake. It was ordinary. Comfortably ordinary. And that was what made what happened next feel so impossible. At exactly 1:24 in the afternoon, witnesses would later say they heard an engine before they understood the danger. Not the loud roar of a racing car. Not the screech of brakes. Just the heavy mechanical growl of a white rental van accelerating with horrifying purpose. In the span of seconds, normal life shattered. The Chevrolet Express climbed the curb near the intersection of Yonge Street and Finch Avenue as though the sidewalk itself were simply another lane of traffic. Pedestrians barely had time to turn their heads. Some heard screaming before impact. Others remembered only confusion, the impossible sight of a van charging directly toward human beings. Then came the sound. Bodies striking metal. The wet crack of impact. Shopping bags exploding across pavement. Shoes flying into the air without owners attached to them anymore. A stroller spinning violently across concrete. The sound of dozens of voices trying to scream at once. Witnesses would later struggle to describe the chaos because the human brain is not built to process that level of violence in broad daylight. One moment there were strangers checking their phones and waiting for buses. The next there were broken bodies scattered across Yonge Street like debris after an explosion. The van did not stop. It kept moving south. Faster. Deliberate. Witnesses said the driver seemed calm. Focused. Almost detached. Surveillance footage would later reveal pedestrians leaping out of the way at the last second, some diving behind mailboxes or storefronts while others froze in place, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. A city bus driver watched in horror as the van bounced over the curb and struck person after person. Cyclists abandoned their bicycles and ran. One woman desperately pulled another stranger out of the vehicle's path only moments before impact. Another man screamed warnings until his voice gave out. The violence stretched for nearly 2 kilometers. 2 endless kilometers of terror. Imagine standing on a busy sidewalk during lunch hour, hearing screams from blocks away, and realizing something is coming toward you. Something unstoppable. Something driven by intention rather than accident. Witnesses described seeing people thrown into the air like ragdolls. One body landed on the hood before rolling off onto the pavement. Another victim was dragged beneath the chassis. Storefront windows reflected scenes so grotesque that some bystanders later said they could still see them whenever they closed their eyes at night. And inside the van sat a 25-year-old man named Alec Minassian. Alone. Silent. Driving forward. As paramedics rushed toward the unfolding massacre, emergency dispatch lines across Toronto erupted into chaos. Calls poured in faster than operators could process them. There's a van hitting people. There are bodies everywhere. Send everyone. Oh my God, please send everyone. Sirens began echoing through the downtown corridor. Police cruisers sped through intersections. Firefighters prepared for mass casualties. Trauma surgeons across the city would soon find their emergency rooms overflowing with victims whose injuries looked more like war wounds than traffic accidents. Shoes remained abandoned on sidewalks. Cell phones rang unanswered beside pools of blood. Half-finished coffees leaked into storm drains. Some victims died instantly. Others were still conscious when help arrived, staring upward in shock, unable to understand how an ordinary Monday afternoon had transformed into a nightmare. And perhaps most terrifying of all was this simple fact: the attack did not come from a hidden bomb planted in secret. It did not involve military weapons or organized cells operating from the shadows. It came from a rented van. Something millions of people see every day without fear. That realization sent a particular kind of horror through Toronto. Because if a sidewalk could become a killing field within seconds, then nowhere truly felt safe anymore. Several blocks away, witnesses watched the van finally come to a stop after colliding with obstacles near Yonge Street and Shepherd Avenue. The front end was crushed. Smoke drifted from beneath the hood. But the driver emerged alive. Calm. Almost emotionless. Police officer Ken Lam arrived moments later and confronted the suspect alone in the middle of the street. The scene looked less like reality and more like the climax of a crime thriller. The suspect reached into his pocket and pointed an object at the officer, shouting for him to shoot. Witnesses held their breath. Some expected gunfire at any second. Lam drew his weapon but did not fire. The suspect continued demanding death. "Shoot me in the head. Shoot me in the fucking head. But Officer Lamb noticed something crucial. The object in Minassian's hand was not a gun. It was a wallet. A black wallet shaped just enough like a handgun to create panic. In another moment, with another officer, the confrontation might have ended in a hail of bullets. Instead, Lamb remained steady. Calm. Controlled. He ordered the suspect to lie down. And slowly, almost casually, Alec Minassian surrendered. Just minutes earlier, he had turned one of Canada's busiest streets into a corridor of death. Now he was lying face down on asphalt in handcuffs while sirens screamed around him. The footage of that arrest would later spread across the world. But what disturbed investigators even more than the attack itself was what they discovered afterward. Because this was not merely an act of rage or madness erupting spontaneously. It was something colder. Something ideologically poisoned. Hours after the attack, detectives uncovered a Facebook post made shortly before the massacre. In it, Minassian referenced the Incel Rebellion, praising mass killer Elliot Rodger, a man already infamous for murdering 6 people in California in 2014 before killing himself. To many people hearing the term for the first time, incel sounded harmlessly awkward. Internet slang. Socially isolated men complaining online about loneliness and rejection. But investigators soon realized they were staring into something far darker, an online subculture built on resentment, humiliation, misogyny, and fantasies of violent revenge. A hidden digital ecosystem where some men convinced each other that women owed them affection, sex, attention, validation. And when reality failed to match those expectations, hatred filled the void. Alec Minassian became one of the most infamous examples of how internet radicalization could mutate loneliness into violence. Yet even now, years later, there remains something chillingly difficult to fully explain about him. People who knew him described someone awkward, socially isolated, strange, but not openly violent. Former classmates remembered him as quiet and withdrawn. There were no criminal records suggesting a future mass killer. No gang affiliations. No history of physical assaults. No obvious warning signs screaming catastrophe. That uncertainty is what lingers beneath the surface of this story like an infection. Because if evil arrived wearing the face of a monster, society would know how to protect itself. But Alec Minassian looked ordinary. He rented a van. He drove through traffic. He passed strangers who had no idea they were seconds away from death. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of his mind, he had already decided who deserved to live and who deserved to die. In the hours after the attack, Toronto entered a state of collective grief unlike anything the city had experienced in years. Streets once filled with urgency became eerily silent beneath flashing police lights. Families waited beside phones that never rang. Hospitals became gathering points for panic and prayer. Reporters crowded behind police tape while investigators marked evidence scattered across kilometers of pavement. Candles appeared near the attack site before sunset even arrived. Flowers piled higher with every passing hour. Strangers hugged each other without speaking. Some cried openly on subway platforms. Others stared numbly at television screens replaying footage of the white van again and again and again. Because everyone wanted answers. Why would someone do this? Why target strangers? Why women? Why here? Why now? But answers would not come easily. This story would eventually become more than a mass murder investigation. It would force difficult conversations about toxic masculinity, online extremism, mental health, loneliness, radicalization, and the frightening speed at which hatred can spread in isolated corners of the internet. It would expose digital communities where violence against women was celebrated rather than condemned. And perhaps most disturbingly, it would reveal how modern extremism no longer always requires organized groups or political manifestos. Sometimes all it takes is isolation, obsession, resentment, and a screen glowing in the dark at 3 a.m. Yet before the headlines, before the courtroom debates, before psychologists and journalists tried to dissect Alec Minassian's motives, there were victims. Real people. Mothers. Daughters. Husbands. Immigrants. Students. Grandparents. Ordinary lives interrupted in seconds. Some had survived wars in other countries only to die on a peaceful Canadian sidewalk. Some were on lunch breaks. Some were simply crossing the street. One was carrying groceries. Another was walking to a bank appointment. None of them knew that a stranger they had never met had already sentenced them in his mind. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with ideology. Not with internet forums. Not with courtroom arguments. It begins on a spring afternoon beneath the pale Toronto sun, where ordinary people stepped onto Yonge Street believing they would return home by dinner. They never did. Toronto has always carried two personalities at once. To outsiders, it is often described as clean, safe, polite, almost painfully civilized compared to other major North American cities. Glass towers rise above orderly streets. Streetcars glide past neighborhoods where dozens of languages drift through the air within a single block. The city breathes with the rhythm of immigration, ambition, and quiet endurance. But beneath that polished surface lives something more complicated. Toronto is a city of invisible loneliness. Millions of people move shoulder to shoulder every day without ever truly seeing each other. In winter especially, isolation settles over the city like fog. People lower their heads against the cold and disappear into apartment towers stacked like concrete filing cabinets for human lives. Strangers share elevators in silence. Subway riders stare at glowing phone screens while the train rattles through darkness underground. For some, the city offers opportunity. For others, it becomes a place where loneliness can deepen unnoticed for years. By April of 2018, spring had finally begun pulling Toronto out of another brutal winter. Dirty snowbanks melted into grey slush along the curbs. Trees showed the first hints of green. Construction crews returned to downtown intersections, filling the streets with the metallic clanging of drills and scaffolding. Patio chairs reappeared outside cafes. Office workers lingered outdoors longer during lunch breaks, savoring sunlight after months trapped beneath heavy coats and frozen skies. Yonge Street, one of the busiest arteries in the entire country, pulsed with constant movement from morning until night. The sidewalks near Finch Avenue were rarely quiet. Students from nearby schools crossed intersections carrying backpacks and iced coffees. Elderly residents shuffled carefully along cracked pavement. Immigrant families pushed strollers past storefronts displaying Korean lettering, Persian bakeries, bubble tea shops, pharmacies, banks, cell phone stores, tiny restaurants squeezed between high-rise towers. The neighborhood reflected modern Toronto itself, crowded, diverse, energetic, restless. On paper, it looked like one of the safest urban environments in the world. Violent crime rates in Canada remained far lower than many American cities. Terror attacks felt distant, things watched on international news rather than experienced firsthand. That illusion of safety mattered because it shaped how people moved through daily life. Most Torontonians did not walk down sidewalks expecting violence. They were not trained to scan rooftops or search for exits or wonder whether the stranger beside them might suddenly become a killer. The city's identity depended partly on that trust. And trust is fragile. Long before the white van mounted the curb on April 23, another story had already been unfolding quietly in bedrooms, online forums, libraries, classrooms, and private thoughts. It was the story of a boy named Alec Minassian. He was born in Richmond Hill, just north of Toronto, into an Armenian immigrant family. By most external measurements, his upbringing appeared stable. There was no public history of severe abuse. No notorious criminal environment. No obvious chaos that investigators could point to later and say that was the beginning. But human beings are rarely shaped only by visible trauma. Sometimes damage forms slowly, invisibly, through years of alienation and humiliation too subtle for outsiders to fully notice. From an early age, Minassian struggled socially. He had developmental challenges and was later diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Former classmates described him as awkward, isolated, intensely uncomfortable in social situations. He often avoided eye contact. Conversations seemed forced and unnatural. Some remembered him trying too hard to fit in and failing in ways that made other students uncomfortable. Others recalled bullying. Not necessarily cinematic cruelty with dramatic confrontations in hallways, but the quieter forms of exclusion children inflict on anyone perceived as different. The ignored jokes. The empty lunch table seats. The subtle signals that tell someone over and over that they do not belong. Adolescence can already feel brutal for people searching desperately for identity. For socially isolated young men, rejection often mutates into something heavier over time. Shame. Resentment. Obsession. Minassian seemed to drift through school without forming meaningful connections. While classmates experienced first relationships, parties, friendships, and ordinary teenage milestones, he remained on the outside watching life happen to other people. That kind of isolation can quietly distort a person's worldview. The world begins to look like a place where everyone else received instructions you somehow missed. After high school, the distance between Minassian and society only deepened. He attended college briefly but struggled there too. Attempts at military service ended quickly. He worked temporary jobs without building stability or purpose. By his mid-20s, he appeared trapped in a cycle familiar to many socially alienated individuals: long periods online, little emotional intimacy, few friendships, mounting frustration, growing detachment from reality outside digital spaces. But isolation alone does not create mass murderers. Millions of lonely people never harm anyone. The more dangerous transformation often occurs when loneliness finds ideology. And the internet is filled with ideologies waiting to welcome vulnerable minds. During the 2010s, hidden corners of online culture began producing increasingly radical communities centered around anger, misogyny, and perceived victimhood. Some existed on obscure forums nearly invisible to mainstream society. Others spread through memes, anonymous message boards, private chats, and algorithm-driven rabbit holes. The language sounded strange to outsiders. Terms like chads, stasis, black pill, red pill, incel. To most people, these words looked absurd or pathetic. But beneath the slang existed a worldview built around resentment and fatalism. Incel stood for involuntary celibate. Originally, the term had been created years earlier by a woman discussing loneliness and dating struggles online. But over time, sections of the community mutated into something darker. Certain forums became echo chambers where socially frustrated men blamed women for their suffering and encouraged each other's bitterness until hatred felt justified. In these digital spaces, rejection was no longer viewed as a painful but ordinary human experience. Instead, it became evidence of a cruel social hierarchy where attractive men supposedly monopolized women while undesirable men were condemned to permanent humiliation. The ideology fed itself constantly. Every failed interaction became proof. Every romantic disappointment became political. Every attractive couple seen on the street became another reminder of perceived injustice. Women were discussed less as people and more as symbols of exclusion. Humanity disappeared behind resentment. Some users fantasized openly about revenge. Others idolized mass killers. Elliot Rodger became one of the most infamous figures within these communities after murdering 6 people near the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2014. Rodger left behind videos and manifestos filled with narcissism, misogyny, and rage toward women who rejected him. To most of society, he represented horrifying violence. But within extremist incel circles, he became something closer to a martyr. His name circulated online with disturbing admiration. Alec Minassian absorbed this world gradually. Like many radicalized individuals, he did not suddenly wake up transformed overnight. The process resembled erosion more than explosion. Hours spent online reinforced his grievances until they hardened into identity. He consumed content that validated resentment rather than challenging it. And in isolated minds, validation can feel intoxicating. Especially for someone who already feels invisible. Yet there remained another unsettling layer to Minassian's personality. People who interacted with him often described emotional flatness rather than explosive anger. He was awkward, yes. Strange at times. But not openly violent. Not charismatic. Not a domineering extremist recruiting followers. He drifted through life almost ghost-like. That contradiction would later disturb investigators and psychologists alike. Because mass violence is easier to process when the perpetrator appears monstrous from the beginning. Minassian did not. He looked forgettable. The kind of person passed on sidewalks without notice. While Minassian's internal world darkened, Toronto outside his apartment windows continued functioning normally. Tens of thousands of people walked Yonge Street every day, unaware that somewhere nearby, a man was quietly feeding fantasies of violence. The city itself embodied modern multicultural optimism. Toronto frequently ranked among the world's most livable cities. Violent extremism was often imagined as something imported from foreign conflicts or organized terror networks, not something born from online misogyny and social alienation inside suburban bedrooms. Even law enforcement agencies at the time struggled to fully understand the emerging threat posed by lone actors radicalized online without direct organizational ties. Traditional warning signs often failed. There were no secret meetings in abandoned warehouses. No encrypted cells planning coordinated attacks. Just isolated individuals spiraling deeper into digital obsession until fantasy collided with reality. In April 2018, few people outside certain internet circles had even heard the term incel. That would change forever. On the morning of April 23, Toronto woke beneath cool spring skies. Traffic thickened along Highway 401. Subway platforms filled with commuters. Construction workers hauled equipment into downtown towers. Somewhere inside the city, mothers packed lunches for children. Elderly residents prepared grocery lists. Office workers checked calendars for afternoon meetings they would never attend. Meanwhile, Alek Minassian was preparing too. Surveillance footage and investigation records later reconstructed pieces of his movements that day. He rented a white Chevrolet Express van from a rider rental location in North York. Employees later described nothing especially alarming about the interaction. He appeared ordinary enough to complete the paperwork and leave. That detail haunts many people afterward in cases like this. The unbearable normality beforehand. A mass casualty attack hidden behind routine transactions. The van itself was large, heavy, powerful enough to become a weapon capable of catastrophic destruction once accelerated into crowds. Yet in another context, it would have looked completely mundane. A contractor's vehicle. A delivery van. Something invisible among urban traffic. Investigators later believed Minassian intentionally chose Yonge Street because of pedestrian density. Lunch hour guaranteed crowded sidewalks. The attack was designed for maximum casualties. And somewhere during those final hours before violence erupted, the boundary between fantasy and action disappeared completely inside his mind. It is difficult to know exactly what he felt driving toward Yonge Street that afternoon. Fear, excitement, dissociation, determination, perhaps all at once. Many perpetrators later describe emotional numbness before committing violence, as though reality itself becomes distant. Witnesses who encountered Minassian shortly before the attack noticed nothing extraordinary. He obeyed traffic lights. He drove among ordinary commuters. Entire lives passed beside him at intersections without realizing death sat only feet away behind tinted glass. That hidden proximity between normal life and catastrophe would become one of the defining horrors of the Toronto van attack. Because unlike disasters caused by storms or mechanical failure, this violence originated from human intention concealed beneath ordinary appearance. And ordinary appearance is what people trust most. By early afternoon, Yonge Street remained crowded with pedestrians enjoying the improving weather. Some walked alone listening to music through headphones. Others carried shopping bags or balanced takeout containers on their way back to offices. Tourists photographed storefronts. Couples argued quietly while crossing intersections. A city moved through routine unaware that history was seconds away from rupturing. Somewhere nearby, the white van approached. Before the white van became the center of international headlines, before analysts debated ideology and extremism, before courtroom sketches captured the emotionless face of Alek Minassian sitting beneath fluorescent lights, there were ordinary people living ordinary lives across Toronto. That is the cruelest reality inside every mass casualty attack. History tends to remember perpetrators because violence creates notoriety, but the true story belongs to the people whose futures were stolen in seconds. On April 23, 2018, 11 individuals would lose their lives because a stranger decided their existence no longer mattered. Each victim carried a world inside them. Families, memories, habits, plans for tomorrow. Tiny routines nobody notices until they suddenly vanish forever. Some had survived wars and immigration struggles only to die on a peaceful sidewalk in Canada. Some had spent decades building families and careers. Others were still beginning adulthood. And when investigators later retraced the victims' final hours, what emerged was not a collection of statistics, but a portrait of humanity interrupted mid-sentence. One of those lives belonged to 80-year-old Anne-Marie D'Amico. Friends described her as warm, deeply compassionate, and endlessly devoted to helping vulnerable people. She worked as a mental health worker and social service volunteer, the kind of person who spent years quietly supporting others through darkness without demanding recognition for herself. On the morning of the attack, she moved through her routine like any other Monday. Nothing about the day suggested finality. She left home carrying plans, responsibilities, conversations still unfinished. Like many Torontonians, she walked Yonge Street countless times without fear because sidewalks are supposed to be safe places. Human beings are conditioned to trust certain environments. We expect danger on battlefields, perhaps in dark alleys late at night, but not under daylight beside coffee shops and pharmacies. Anne-Marie represented the gentle architecture of everyday kindness that keeps cities functioning. The type of person strangers rely on without even realizing it. When she died, grief spread not only through family but through entire communities shaped by her care. Another victim, 94-year-old Dorothy Sewell, had lived long enough to witness nearly an entire century of history. She survived eras most younger people only read about in textbooks. Economic depression, World War, immigration waves, political upheaval, technological revolutions. She carried decades of memories inside her mind. Family photographs, birthdays, funerals, weddings, quiet afternoons, arguments forgotten years ago, the accumulated emotional weight of almost a century alive. At 94, every ordinary day becomes especially precious because time itself grows visibly fragile. Yet on April 23, Dorothy simply stepped into the city like thousands of others. There was no warning. No final dramatic realization. Just the sudden arrival of unimaginable violence. Her death devastated relatives who later struggled to comprehend how someone who survived nearly 100 years could be killed randomly during a daytime walk in Toronto. Then there was 45-year-old Bhutis Renuka Amarasing, a single mother originally from Sri Lanka. Her story carried the familiar resilience shared by many immigrants who rebuild entire lives in foreign countries. She worked hard, cared deeply for her son, and maintained close ties with her community. Friends remembered her smile first. The warmth she brought into conversations. The determination beneath her kindness. Immigrant families often carry invisible burdens outsiders rarely notice: homesickness, financial stress, cultural adaptation, the pressure to succeed after sacrifice. Yet they also carry extraordinary endurance. Renuka represented that endurance. She had already overcome hardship long before crossing paths with Alec Minassian. Her death left behind a son forced to navigate unimaginable grief and the terrifying realization that life can collapse without logic or fairness. Another victim, 65-year-old Chulminit Eddie Kang, immigrated from South Korea decades earlier and built a life through relentless work. Those who knew him described discipline, generosity, and humility. Like many immigrants, he understood survival not as abstract philosophy but as daily practice. Long hours, sacrifice, responsibility, providing stability for loved ones. The attack erased all of it within seconds. Families later described the agony of waiting for confirmation after the attack. Phones unanswered. Hospitals contacted one by one. The unbearable stretch of uncertainty before truth arrives. Some relatives searched emergency rooms desperately hoping their loved ones were merely injured. Others already sensed something terrible from the silence itself. Silence becomes terrifying during disasters. Every unanswered call feels heavier. Every passing minute sharpens dread. In another corner of Toronto that morning, 22-year-old student So Hee-chung moved through life with the energy and uncertainty of early adulthood. Young adulthood carries a particular emotional intensity because the future still feels enormous. Careers remain unwritten. Relationships unfinished. Possibilities endless. Friends later described So Hee as intelligent, caring, ambitious. The kind of young woman still shaping who she would become. There is something uniquely cruel about interrupted youth because death arrives before identity fully forms. Parents lose not only the child they knew, but also the future version they will never meet. The wedding photos that will never exist. The grandchildren never born. The career never completed. Entire timelines erased. Another victim, 73-year-old Jun Hyun Kim, immigrated to Canada from Korea and spent years building a quiet life rooted in faith and community. Relatives remembered her as deeply devoted to family, someone who valued simple moments over attention or status. Her death echoed painfully through immigrant communities across Toronto because many saw themselves reflected in her story. People who arrived in Canada believing they had found safety and opportunity. People who trusted this city enough to walk its streets without fear. The victims came from different backgrounds, different generations, different cultures, but they shared one devastating commonality: none of them were chosen for who they were individually. They were targeted because they happened to exist in public space at the wrong moment. Random violence creates a unique psychological horror because it destroys the comforting illusion that good decisions guarantee safety. These victims were not engaged in dangerous activities. They were not involved in criminal worlds. They were simply living. And perhaps nowhere did grief settle more heavily than within the families left behind afterward. In the days following the attack, relatives faced impossible tasks. Identifying bodies. Planning funerals. Answering reporters' questions while barely able to process reality themselves. Some family members later described feeling numb for weeks. Others replayed final conversations endlessly searching for meaning in ordinary words spoken hours before death. Did I say goodbye properly? Did they know I loved them? Could anything have changed if they left home 5 minutes later? Human beings instinctively search for alternate timelines after tragedy because randomness feels psychologically unbearable. One mother reportedly continued setting a place at the dinner table temporarily because routine felt easier than acceptance. Another family preserved voicemail messages afraid the sound of a loved one's voice might fade from memory. Grief after sudden violence behaves differently than grief after illness or old age. There is no gradual preparation. No emotional countdown. The mind remains trapped between disbelief and horror. For survivors injured in the attack, trauma continued long after physical wounds healed. Some suffered catastrophic injuries requiring multiple surgeries. Broken bones. Brain trauma. Internal bleeding. Permanent disabilities. But psychological injuries often ran deeper. Witnesses described recurring nightmares involving engines revving behind them. Some could no longer walk comfortably through crowded streets. Others developed panic attacks triggered by white vans or screeching tires. One survivor later explained that everyday sounds suddenly carried danger afterward. A vehicle accelerating at an intersection could send adrenaline flooding through the body instantly. Trauma rewires ordinary perception. The world no longer feels predictable. Even first responders carried emotional scars from what they encountered on Yonge Street. Paramedics later described scenes unlike anything they had previously experienced in civilian life. Bodies scattered across sidewalks. Severe crush injuries. Survivors screaming for missing relatives. Blood smeared across storefront windows. Some emergency workers would later require counseling after witnessing the aftermath. Because no amount of professional training fully prepares human beings for mass casualty violence inflicted intentionally against strangers. The attack also struck Toronto's identity at its emotional center. This city prided itself on multicultural harmony, safety, and coexistence. People from dozens of backgrounds shared neighborhoods, public transit, sidewalks, schools. The randomness of the attack created collective mourning because virtually anyone could imagine themselves among the victims. Office workers recognized the lunch hour routines. Immigrant families recognized the sacrifices. Elderly residents recognized familiar sidewalks. Students recognized themselves in the younger victims. Suddenly Yonge Street no longer felt like just another busy road. It became sacred ground marked by grief. In the evenings after the attack, memorials began appearing along sidewalks near the impact zones. Flowers accumulated faster than volunteers could organize them. Candles flickered beneath photographs of smiling faces now frozen permanently in happier moments. Handwritten messages covered concrete barriers. Some notes came from strangers who never met the victims but felt emotionally shattered anyway. That is another strange truth about mass violence. It creates temporary emotional intimacy between strangers. People cry for lives they never personally knew because tragedy exposes shared vulnerability. For several days, Toronto moved more quietly. Subway conversations softened. Crowds gathered at vigils carrying candles against the cold evening air. Religious leaders from multiple faiths stood together in mourning. Churches, mosques, temples, and community centers opened their doors to grieving families. In a city often criticized for emotional distance, collective grief briefly dissolved barriers between strangers. Yet beneath the mourning existed another uncomfortable emotion too: fear. Because if a sidewalk could transform into a massacre scene within seconds, then ordinary life itself suddenly felt fragile. Parents held children's hands tighter crossing intersections. Pedestrians instinctively stepped farther from curbs whenever vehicles approached. Some people avoided Yonge Street entirely for months afterward. Safety, once broken psychologically, does not return easily. But perhaps the deepest wound involved the realization that many victims specifically appeared to be women. Investigators and prosecutors later argued that misogynistic ideology influenced Minassian's targeting choices. This transformed the attack from random mass violence into something even more disturbing for many women across Canada and beyond. It forced conversations about harassment, entitlement, online radicalization, and male resentment that had long existed beneath society's surface. Women reading headlines recognized familiar fears amplified to horrifying extremes. The idea that a stranger could hate women so deeply he would weaponize a van against pedestrians shattered any illusion that misogyny exists only as rude comments or isolated incidents. Families of the victims often faced another painful challenge afterward: protecting their loved ones' humanity from being overshadowed by the killer's infamy. True crime culture frequently centers perpetrators because violence attracts attention. But behind every headline stood real individuals whose stories deserved remembrance beyond the manner of their deaths. Parents shared childhood memories. Friends described laughter. Co-workers recalled kindness invisible to the wider world before tragedy forced strangers to learn their names. Those personal details mattered because they restored humanity stolen by violence. And Marie D'Amico was not merely victim number one. She was a compassionate woman who dedicated years to helping vulnerable people. Renuka Amorazing was not just a casualty statistic. She was a mother whose son lost the center of his world. Dorothy Sewell was not merely elderly. She was nearly a century of memories erased in seconds. And somewhere amid the endless media coverage, courtroom proceedings, psychological analyses, and internet debates, grieving families tried desperately to preserve those truths. Because mass murder does not only destroy bodies. It threatens to reduce entire human lives into footnotes beneath a killer's name. That is why remembering the victims matters. Not as symbols. Not as abstract tragedy. But as people who woke up on a Monday morning expecting ordinary life to continue. People who had favorite meals, unfinished errands, family arguments, future plans, private fears, and people waiting for them to come home. They stepped onto Yonge Street trusting the world around them. They never knew that somewhere nearby, a stranger had already decided to turn their ordinary afternoon into one of the darkest days in modern Canadian history. At 1:22 p.m., traffic along Yonge Street moved with the slow impatience typical of downtown Toronto. Drivers leaned forward at red lights. Pedestrians crossed intersections in clusters, weaving around one another with unconscious choreography learned from years of urban life. A woman balanced a coffee tray while checking her phone. Two office workers laughed beside a bus stop. An elderly couple waited for the pedestrian signal to change. Above them, sunlight reflected sharply off glass towers, forcing some people to squint as they walked south toward lunch appointments and subway entrances. It looked like an ordinary weekday afternoon because it was one. That simple fact would later become one of the most horrifying parts of the attack. There had been no storm warning. No gunshots announcing danger from a distance. No visible sign that violence was approaching. Just another white van in traffic among thousands of vehicles moving through Toronto every hour. Inside that van sat Alec Minassian, 25 years old. Alone. Driving a rented Chevrolet Express southbound along Yonge Street. Investigators later determined that by this point, the attack had already become inevitable in his mind. Whatever hesitation might once have existed was gone. The boundary between fantasy and reality had dissolved. He had spent years feeding resentment in isolation, consuming online communities that transformed humiliation into ideology. And now those ideas were about to erupt into physical destruction against complete strangers. Witnesses later struggled to remember exactly when confusion became terror. Some first noticed the van accelerating strangely. Others heard screaming before they understood why people were running. One witness described hearing what sounded like a collision, then another in rapid succession, almost rhythmic in its brutality. Another remembered turning around after hearing a woman yell only to see bodies already lying on the sidewalk behind the moving van. At approximately 1:24 p.m., Minassian steered the van onto the sidewalk near Yonge Street and Finch Avenue. In that instant, the city's ordinary geometry collapsed. Sidewalks exist as protected spaces. Human beings are conditioned from childhood to trust them. Cars belong on roads. People belong on sidewalks. The attack shattered that invisible social contract within seconds. The heavy white van surged forward over the curb without slowing. The first impact happened almost immediately. A pedestrian disappeared beneath the front of the vehicle with a sound witnesses would later describe as impossible to forget. Not cinematic. Not clean. Just violent mechanical force colliding with the fragility of the human body. Then came another impact. And another. The van continued south. Fast. Deliberate. Witnesses watched in disbelief as people were thrown into the air or crushed beneath the wheels. Some froze completely, unable to process what they were seeing. Others sprinted instinctively toward storefronts or dove behind poles and benches. A cyclist abandoned his bike and leapt sideways moments before the van ripped past him. A woman grabbing coffee looked up just in time to see bodies tumbling across concrete ahead of her. She later said the scene felt unreal, like watching a nightmare through glass. The van bounced violently as it mounted curbs and struck victims. Surveillance footage later revealed pedestrians scattering in every direction while others remained trapped by shock. Human reaction times fail under sudden catastrophe. The brain first tries to interpret danger rationally. Maybe it's an accident. Maybe the driver lost control. But the longer the van continued targeting pedestrians, the clearer the truth became. This was intentional. Minassian drove nearly 2 kilometers along Yonge Street, using the sidewalk itself as a killing corridor. The route transformed one of Toronto's busiest pedestrian areas into a scene of sustained terror. Bodies lay scattered behind the vehicle while new victims appeared ahead. Witnesses heard screaming from blocks away. Some survivors described hearing the engine revving aggressively moments before impact. Others remembered the terrible silence afterward, broken only by cries for help and the distant approach of sirens. Several victims never had time to react at all. The speed and unpredictability of the attack erased warning. One moment they were walking. The next they were airborne or crushed against concrete. A witness standing near a bus stop later described seeing a stroller spinning empty across the sidewalk after impact. Another saw shoes scattered everywhere, separated from their owners by force violent enough to tear them loose. These details haunted investigators because they reflected the sheer physical devastation unleashed in seconds. Shoes abandoned beside bloodstains. Grocery bags burst open across pavement. Eyeglasses crushed beneath tires. Everyday objects transformed into evidence of catastrophe. Inside nearby businesses, customers and employees pressed against windows watching horror unfold outside. Some screamed for people to get inside. Others rushed toward victims after the van passed. Restaurant workers grabbed first aid kits. Store owners locked doors while trying to shelter terrified pedestrians. Chaos spread unevenly because no one initially understood the scale of what was happening. Rumors raced faster than facts. Some believed multiple attackers were involved. Others feared explosives or firearms might follow. In mass casualty events, uncertainty multiplies panic. A woman crossing the street near Shepherd Avenue later recalled hearing someone shout, "Run," before seeing people sprinting toward her covered in blood. Another witness remembered making eye contact with a victim moments before impact, describing the expression as pure confusion rather than fear. The human brain struggles to comprehend impossible danger until it is already too late. Manassian remained inside the van throughout the attack, continuing forward with chilling focus. Witnesses who briefly saw his face later described emotional emptiness more than rage. No visible panic. No hesitation. Just forward movement. That emotional detachment disturbed investigators deeply afterward because it suggested not explosive emotional breakdown but controlled intent. Some survivors later said the randomness felt psychologically unbearable. There had been no argument. No warning. No interaction whatsoever. The victims were targeted simply because they occupied public space. As the attack continued southbound, emergency calls flooded Toronto dispatch centers. Operators struggled to process overlapping reports. There's a van hitting people. Multiple casualties. Send ambulances. There are bodies everywhere. Some callers screamed so intensely dispatchers could barely understand locations. Others spoke with eerie calm, shock flattening emotion into mechanical detail. Police units began racing toward Yonge Street from multiple directions while paramedics prepared for what was quickly escalating into a mass casualty incident unlike anything Toronto had faced in years. The first emergency responders arriving at the scene encountered devastation spread across multiple blocks. Victims lay motionless beside shattered glass and twisted bicycles. Survivors staggered through intersections bleeding and disoriented. Witnesses pointed south, trying to direct officers toward the fleeing van. Some first responders later admitted they initially believed the casualty reports had been exaggerated because the scale sounded impossible. Then they saw the sidewalk. One paramedic later described stepping from the ambulance into total sensory overload, screaming, blood, traffic horns, crying witnesses, bodies in unnatural positions. Training took over because emotion had to wait. Triage decisions began instantly. Who was still breathing? Who could survive with immediate intervention? Who was already gone? The attack forced emergency crews into battlefield-style medicine in the middle of downtown Toronto. Tourniquets improvised from clothing. CPR performed on sidewalks. Victims loaded into ambulances so quickly that stretchers became difficult to track. Nurses across nearby hospitals received warnings to prepare for incoming trauma victims. Operating rooms were cleared. Additional surgeons called in. Police meanwhile focused on stopping the van before even more people died. Witness descriptions guided officers southward through chaos. Then, after nearly 2 kilometers of violence, the attack abruptly ended near Yonge Street and Shepherd Avenue. The van came to a stop after striking obstacles along the roadway. Smoke drifted faintly from the damaged vehicle. For a brief moment, there was confusion. Some witnesses thought the driver might be dead or injured. Instead, the driver's door opened. Alec Manassian stepped out alive. Several witnesses watched from nearby sidewalks and storefronts as the confrontation unfolded. Toronto police officer Ken Lam arrived alone and exited his cruiser with weapon drawn. The scene carried unbearable tension. Bodies still lay scattered blocks behind them. Sirens screamed in the distance. Witnesses feared the suspect might begin shooting. Instead, Minassian reached into his pocket and pointed an object toward Officer Lamb. "Kill me," he shouted repeatedly. "Shoot me in the head." Some witnesses ducked behind cars expecting gunfire. Others froze, unable to look away. Lamb maintained distance, weapon trained on the suspect. The object in Minassian's hand appeared dark and vaguely gun-shaped. But something about it felt wrong. Lamb later realized the suspect was holding a wallet, attempting suicide by cop. Another officer might have fired instinctively. In that moment, adrenaline and uncertainty could easily have ended with Minassian dead on the street. Instead, Lamb stayed composed. He ordered the suspect to get down. Minassian continued demanding death but gradually complied. Then, almost anticlimactically compared to the horror preceding it, the attack ended with handcuffs clicking around his wrists. Witnesses stared in disbelief. The man responsible for unimaginable destruction stood alive beside police vehicles while paramedics continued treating victims nearby. Some survivors later expressed anger that he had survived at all. Others felt relief that answers might still emerge through interrogation and trial. But in those first moments after arrest, very little was understood. Officers knew only that a mass casualty attack had occurred. They did not yet know why. As police searched the van and secured the scene, Toronto itself entered collective shock. News helicopters circled overhead broadcasting live footage nationwide. Social media filled with videos and frantic eyewitness accounts. Rumors spread rapidly online. Terrorism speculation emerged almost immediately. Government officials rushed toward emergency briefings while hospitals struggled to manage incoming casualties. Along Yonge Street, investigators began the grim process of documenting the dead. Yellow police tape stretched across intersections. Evidence markers appeared beside shoes, phones, bags, broken eyeglasses. White sheets covered bodies while forensic teams photographed impact zones extending block after block. Witnesses wandered nearby crying or staring blankly into space. Some still clutched strangers' blood on their clothing after attempting to help victims. Others searched desperately for missing loved ones, moving between hospitals with photographs displayed on shaking phones. One man reportedly walked the sidewalks repeatedly calling his wife's name. Nearby residents watched from apartment windows above streets transformed into crime scenes. The emotional atmosphere shifted strangely as afternoon faded toward evening. Initial chaos gave way to numbness. Traffic disappeared. Usually crowded sidewalks fell silent beneath flashing emergency lights. Television reporters spoke in hushed tones behind police barricades. Strangers embraced one another without speaking. And through it all lingered a single horrifying realization: this had not been an accident. A man had deliberately transformed an ordinary city street into a weaponized space for killing strangers. In the hours afterward, investigators searched for motive. Was it terrorism? Mental illness? Personal grievance? Organized extremism? Then they discovered the Facebook post. Minutes before the attack, Minassian had written about the Insel Rebellion and referenced Elliot Rodger, the California mass killer already idolized in misogynistic online communities. Suddenly, the attack expanded beyond Toronto itself. It became part of a larger, more disturbing conversation about online radicalization, male resentment, and extremist violence incubated in digital isolation. But those broader debates came later. In the immediate aftermath, all that existed was grief. Ambulances carrying victims through traffic. Families receiving impossible phone calls. Witnesses replaying screams in their minds. A city struggling to comprehend how normal life had ruptured so violently in broad daylight. The sidewalk along Yonge Street would eventually be cleaned. Blood washed away. Traffic resumed. New pedestrians would one day walk the same route again. But for those who witnessed the attack, and for the families whose loved ones never came home, the street would never feel entirely ordinary again. Because on April 23, 2018, under clear spring skies in the middle of Toronto, Ordinary life lasted right up until the moment a white van climbed the curb. By late afternoon, Yonge Street no longer resembled the familiar artery of downtown Toronto that millions recognized. The sidewalks were sealed behind expanding lines of yellow police tape. Traffic lights continued cycling mechanically from green to red above nearly empty intersections, as though the city itself had not yet understood what had happened beneath them. The spring sunlight that earlier reflected warmly off glass towers now illuminated a landscape of devastation. Scattered shoes remained where victims had been struck. Broken phones vibrated occasionally with incoming calls no one would answer. Shopping bags torn open during impact spilled groceries and personal belongings across concrete streaked with blood. In some places, investigators used numbered evidence markers beside fragments of shattered eyeglasses, twisted bicycle frames, and dark stains still wet against the pavement. Toronto police officers moved carefully through the scene, speaking in low voices while forensic teams photographed every meter of destruction. The attack route stretched nearly 2 kilometers, forcing investigators to treat multiple city blocks as one enormous crime scene. Witnesses watched from behind barricades wrapped in blankets handed out by emergency workers. Some were crying openly. Others sat silently in shock, staring toward the sidewalks where they had nearly died only hours earlier. The atmosphere carried the strange stillness that often follows mass trauma, when reality feels suspended between disbelief and horror. Even experienced officers later admitted the scale of the scene unsettled them deeply. This was not a contained murder site hidden inside an apartment or alley. Violence had exploded openly across one of Canada's busiest pedestrian corridors during broad daylight. Everywhere investigators looked, ordinary city life had been interrupted mid-motion. A coffee cup crushed beneath a tire. A child's toy lying alone near the curb. A single glove several meters away from its owner. Tiny details became emotionally unbearable because they revealed how abruptly life had ended for some victims. One forensic investigator later described the eerie intimacy of mass casualty scenes. Unlike movies, real tragedy leaves behind fragments of human routine. Prescription receipts. Lunch containers. Family photographs tucked inside wallets. Objects that hours earlier belonged to living people with plans for the evening. As emergency crews transported survivors to hospitals across Toronto, detectives began the massive task of reconstructing exactly what happened. Surveillance cameras from buses, storefronts, intersections, apartment buildings, and traffic systems captured different pieces of the attack. Officers moved quickly to secure footage before systems automatically recorded over it. In the digital age, modern cities become accidental witnesses to violence. Nearly every intersection along Yonge Street had some form of surveillance. Investigators knew those recordings would become crucial not only for prosecution but for understanding the attacker's behavior second by second. Yet reviewing that footage came with psychological cost. Detectives later described watching pedestrians vanish beneath the van frame by frame, studying horror repeatedly in search of clarity. Meanwhile, paramedics and emergency room staff fought to save the wounded. Hospitals entered crisis mode. Trauma surgeons operated through the evening on victims suffering catastrophic injuries, crushed limbs, severe internal bleeding, spinal trauma, traumatic brain injuries. Some patients arrived conscious but unable to comprehend what had happened. Others drifted in and out of awareness, asking repeatedly about loved ones who had already died. Nurses later recalled blood covering emergency room floors faster than crews could clean it. Family members crowded waiting rooms clutching phones and praying for updates while police attempted the painful process of identifying victims. In many cases, identification took hours because injuries were so severe and personal belongings had been scattered across multiple blocks. Some relatives learned the truth through television before authorities reached them officially. Others drove from hospital to hospital searching desperately for missing family members. One woman reportedly refused to leave an emergency department hallway for nearly 6 hours because she believed her husband might still be alive inside surgery. Another family spent the evening calling every trauma center in the city while staring at news footage of the attack route, terrified they might recognize clothing among the victims. The emotional chaos surrounding mass casualty events often spreads far beyond the immediate scene. Entire social circles collapse into panic simultaneously. Friends text each other frantically. Employers account for missing co-workers. Schools contact parents. Communities refresh news updates, obsessively searching for names not yet released publicly. At police headquarters, investigators focused immediately on the man now sitting in custody, Alek Minassian. Officers searched his background for any indication of accomplices or broader terror connections. In the first hours after an attack, uncertainty becomes dangerous. Authorities could not yet rule out additional threats. Was this coordinated? Was someone else planning another assault? Did the suspect possess explosives or firearms elsewhere? Tactical units searched locations connected to Minassian while intelligence officers combed through digital records. Then came one of the first major clues. Detectives discovered a Facebook post published shortly before the attack. The message referenced the Incel Rebellion and praised Elliot Rodger, the California mass killer responsible for the 2014 Isla Vista murders. To many outside internet subcultures, the language looked cryptic and bizarre. But investigators familiar with online extremist communities immediately recognized the significance. The attack was no longer viewed solely as random violence. It appeared ideologically motivated, tied to misogynistic online radicalization. That discovery altered the entire trajectory of the investigation. Detectives now had to understand not only what Minassian did, but why he believed mass murder carried meaning. Officers began tracing his online activity through forums, message boards, and social media archives. What they found revealed years of social isolation intertwined with digital obsession. Minassian had immersed himself in online spaces centered around resentment toward women and glorification of previous killers. Investigators uncovered posts discussing loneliness, rejection, and admiration for violent figures already celebrated within extremist incel communities. Yet despite these discoveries, the psychological portrait remained deeply unsettling because Minassian did not fit many traditional assumptions about violent extremists. Former classmates and acquaintances described awkwardness rather than aggression. He lacked charisma. He did not appear politically driven in conventional ways. He had no criminal history suggesting escalating violence. Instead, investigators faced the frightening reality of modern lone actor extremism, radicalization occurring almost entirely through isolation and online reinforcement rather than direct organizational recruitment. Back on Yonge Street, forensic teams worked late into the night beneath portable floodlights. Temperatures dropped as spring evening settled across Toronto. The scene became quieter after media helicopters departed temporarily, but emotionally the street remained heavy with grief. Officers documented tire marks where the van mounted sidewalks repeatedly. Impact patterns helped reconstruct speed and trajectory. Investigators measured distances between victims, analyzed surveillance timestamps, and mapped the route meter by meter. The sheer length of the attack complicated evidence collection enormously. Unlike a contained homicide scene, evidence stretched across numerous intersections crowded earlier by thousands of pedestrians. Rain or heavy traffic could have destroyed critical details if police had not secured the area rapidly. Witness interviews also became central to the investigation. Hundreds of people had seen some portion of the attack unfold. Detectives spent hours gathering statements from survivors, drivers, shop owners, bus passengers, and pedestrians. Some witnesses remained coherent and detailed despite shock. Others struggled emotionally to describe what they saw. Trauma fragments memory unpredictably. Several witnesses gave conflicting estimates about speed, direction, or exact sequence because terror distorts perception. Yet common patterns quickly emerged. The van accelerated intentionally. It targeted pedestrians repeatedly rather than attempting to avoid them. The driver showed no visible panic. Witnesses described purposeful movement, not loss of control. One particularly important witness recalled seeing the van swerve toward individuals even when roadway space existed elsewhere. That testimony helped reinforce the conclusion that the attack was deliberate mass murder rather than reckless driving. The confrontation between Officer Ken Lam and Minassian also became a major investigative focus. Body camera footage, witness accounts, and police radio communications documented the tense moments after the attack ended. Investigators recognized how narrowly the arrest avoided becoming another fatal shooting. Minassian's attempt at suicide by cop revealed another psychological dimension to the attack. He appeared prepared for death afterward, perhaps even expecting martyrdom within extremist online circles. Yet Lamb's restraint prevented that outcome. The arrest footage spread rapidly worldwide because it contrasted sharply with the chaos preceding it. One officer standing alone in the street, refusing to panic while confronting a man responsible for unimaginable violence. Many later praised Lamb's composure as extraordinary under pressure. By the following morning, memorials already lined portions of Yonge Street. Flowers accumulated beside handwritten notes and candles. Some messages came from strangers expressing grief and disbelief. Others came from witnesses apologizing to victims they could not save. That emotional response reflected another difficult truth investigators often encounter after mass violence. Survivors frequently carry crushing guilt regardless of whether intervention was realistically possible. People replay moments endlessly wondering if they could have pulled someone away faster, shouted louder, reacted sooner. Rationally, they understand the attack unfolded within seconds. Emotionally, many never forgive themselves. Media coverage intensified rapidly as victim identities gradually emerged. News outlets across the world focused heavily on the incel connection because many viewers had never encountered the term before. Experts debated online radicalization, misogyny, mental illness, and extremist subcultures almost immediately. Yet investigators remained cautious publicly during the early stages. Detectives understood the danger of oversimplifying motive before fully analyzing evidence. Psychological evaluations would eventually become central to the case because Minassian's defense later argued autism spectrum disorder significantly impaired his judgment and emotional understanding. Prosecutors disagreed, arguing the attack reflected ideological hatred and calculated intent rather than inability to comprehend morality. But during those first investigative days, uncertainty still dominated. Detectives continued piecing together timelines from rental records, digital footprints, witness accounts, and forensic evidence. The rented Chevrolet Express itself became a crucial piece of evidence. Forensic teams examined damage patterns, biological traces, and interior contents carefully. They sought any indication of planning beyond what was already known. GPS data helped confirm the attack route precisely. Rental paperwork established timeline details. Investigators discovered Minassian had rented the van legally without raising obvious concerns. That detail deeply disturbed both law enforcement and the public because it underscored how accessible such attacks could be. No sophisticated weapons network was required. No explosives expertise. Just a rental vehicle and intent. As investigators dug deeper into Minassian's digital life, they uncovered evidence of increasing immersion in misogynistic extremist ideology. Online communities he frequented often framed violence as revenge against perceived social rejection. Members praised previous killers while encouraging narratives of victimhood and entitlement. Detectives recognized familiar patterns seen in other forms of radicalization: isolation leading to grievance, grievance reinforced by echo chambers normalizing violence. The internet had allowed resentment to evolve into ideology without requiring physical contact with organized groups. That realization alarmed security experts because it suggested future threats might emerge from similarly isolated individuals radicalized almost entirely online. Yet amid the investigative complexity, the emotional center of the case remained painfully human. Families still identified bodies. Survivors still underwent surgeries. Witnesses still woke during the night hearing phantom screams and engine noises in their dreams. Detectives themselves often carried emotional residue from scenes they investigated. One officer later admitted he could not stop thinking about abandoned shoes along the sidewalk because they symbolized how suddenly ordinary life had been torn apart. Another investigator reportedly struggled after reviewing surveillance footage repeatedly, especially scenes where pedestrians never even turned around before impact. Those details linger because they reveal innocence interrupted before fear fully registers. In the days after the attack, Toronto attempted to continue functioning. Streetcars resumed routes. Businesses reopened. Crowds returned cautiously to Yonge Street. But the atmosphere had changed. Pedestrians instinctively stepped farther from curbs whenever large vehicles passed. Some people avoided crowded sidewalks entirely. Others found themselves scanning drivers' faces unconsciously at intersections. Trust in ordinary public space had fractured. The city could clean blood from pavement and reopen roads, but psychological recovery moved slower. Investigators meanwhile continued building the foundation of what would become one of Canada's most closely watched criminal prosecutions. Every surveillance frame, every witness statement, every digital post, every forensic measurement contributed to understanding not only how the attack unfolded, but how an isolated young man transformed grievance into mass murder beneath the ordinary spring sunlight of downtown Toronto. In the weeks following the attack, Toronto existed in a strange emotional state suspended between grief and obsession. Memorial flowers along Yonge Street multiplied faster than city workers could organize them. News vans remained parked outside police headquarters day and night. Television panels argued endlessly about misogyny, mental illness, online radicalization, and public safety. But inside the investigation itself, detectives confronted a far more complicated reality than the public initially understood. The facts of the attack were horrifyingly clear. Alec Minassian rented a van, drove onto the sidewalk, and deliberately struck pedestrians over nearly 2 kilometers. The physical evidence left little room for doubt regarding responsibility. Yet motive remained far more tangled. Investigators needed to answer not only what happened, but what transformed an awkward, socially isolated young man into a mass killer. And the deeper they looked, the more unsettling the contradictions became. At first glance, the incel connection appeared straightforward. Minassian's Facebook post praising Elliot Rodger and announcing the incel rebellion seemed like a direct ideological confession. Journalists quickly framed the attack as misogynistic terrorism inspired by extremist online communities. Public fear intensified as many people encountered incel ideology for the first time. Forums filled with rage against women, admiration for violence, and fantasies of revenge suddenly became subjects of international scrutiny. But investigators knew early assumptions can distort criminal cases. They needed evidence stronger than headlines. Detectives began reconstructing Minassian's life in exhaustive detail. Former classmates, co-workers, teachers, relatives, military supervisors, and acquaintances were interviewed one after another. Police searched for warning signs that might explain escalation toward violence. Yet many interviews produced the same deeply unsettling response. People remembered Minassian as awkward and socially uncomfortable, but not openly dangerous. Some former classmates described him as lonely. Others recalled inappropriate comments or strange behavior. A few remembered him attempting to fit in unsuccessfully, often becoming the target of ridicule rather than fear. But almost nobody described obvious violent tendencies. One former acquaintance reportedly told investigators he seemed more frightened of the world than threatening toward it. That contradiction haunted the investigation. Society prefers narratives where mass killers appear visibly monstrous beforehand. Clear warning signs create emotional comfort because they suggest violence can be predicted and prevented. Minassian disrupted that expectation. He drifted through life quietly, leaving behind discomfort rather than alarm. Investigators dug deeper into his developmental history. Medical and educational records revealed diagnoses associated with autism spectrum disorder and social difficulties dating back years. Teachers described communication challenges and emotional awkwardness. Family members reportedly worried about his inability to form meaningful relationships or navigate ordinary adult life independently. During his brief attempt at military service, supervisors noted unusual social behavior and emotional immaturity. Yet none of those traits inherently predict violence. Millions of autistic individuals live peaceful lives without harming anyone. Investigators had to separate developmental struggles from ideological radicalization carefully. The defense would later argue that Minassian's neurological condition impaired his emotional understanding and social reasoning significantly. Prosecutors rejected that explanation, insisting he clearly understood right from wrong and planned the attack deliberately. But during the investigation phase, those questions remained unresolved. Detectives also explored whether Minassian acted entirely alone ideologically. Modern extremism often develops within networks, even loosely organized ones online. Officers traced usernames, forum posts, private messages, and internet activity searching for evidence of direct encouragement or co-conspirators. The online communities connected to incel culture proved difficult to navigate. Many forums operated anonymously or disappeared quickly after media attention intensified. Some users posted violent fantasies constantly without ever acting physically. Others treated mass killers as dark celebrities, sharing memes and inside jokes detached from reality. Investigators faced the uncomfortable challenge of distinguishing internet performance from genuine extremist commitment. Was Minassian deeply ideological, or was he parroting language absorbed from toxic online spaces without fully understanding it? The answer mattered legally and psychologically. As forensic analysts examined his devices, they uncovered evidence of obsessive internet use and fascination with previous mass killers. Yet unlike organized terrorists who often leave detailed manifestos, Minassian's internal motivations remained frustratingly fragmented. He appeared emotionally stunted rather than politically coherent. Some detectives privately wondered whether he fully grasped the human consequences of what he had done or whether years of isolation had distorted his empathy beyond recognition. Meanwhile, public attention intensified around the victims and survivors. Hospitals continued treating catastrophic injuries weeks after the attack. Some survivors required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. Others faced permanent disabilities. The randomness of the violence deepened psychological trauma. Survivors described hypervigilance becoming constant afterward. Large vehicles passing nearby triggered panic instantly. Crowded sidewalks felt dangerous. Several witnesses later developed symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbness, sudden panic attacks. Trauma counselors across Toronto saw increasing numbers of patients connected directly or indirectly to the attack. Yet while survivors struggled publicly, the investigation itself entered increasingly complicated territory behind closed doors. Detectives began receiving tips from across Canada and internationally. Some people claimed prior encounters with Minassian online. Others alleged connections to extremist groups that ultimately proved false. Conspiracy theories spread rapidly through internet forums. Certain users insisted hidden political motives existed beyond misogyny. Others falsely claimed government cover-ups or intelligence agency involvement. High-profile crimes often attract misinformation because people instinctively search for larger explanations when confronting random brutality. Investigators had to sift through mountains of irrelevant or fabricated information while focusing on verifiable evidence. One especially difficult aspect involved understanding the role of misogyny in victim selection. Prosecutors believed women were targeted disproportionately because of Minassian's ideological hatred. Yet the attack route itself appeared opportunistic rather than individually selective. The van struck whoever occupied the sidewalk ahead. Some victims were men. Others were elderly pedestrians unlikely connected symbolically to the sexual resentment common in incel rhetoric. Investigators debated internally whether the attack represented specifically gendered violence or broader rage against society itself. Psychological experts consulted during the investigation offered conflicting interpretations. Some viewed Minassian as deeply misogynistic and ideologically driven. Others believed his emotional immaturity and social dysfunction played larger roles than coherent hatred. That ambiguity complicated public understanding because modern audiences often seek simple labels: terrorist, mentally ill, extremist, monster. Real human violence rarely fits neatly into one category. Detectives also examined Minassian's final days before the attack, searching for triggering events. Had a specific rejection occurred? A humiliation? A breakdown? Yet no dramatic catalyst emerged clearly. Instead, the evidence suggested gradual deterioration over years. Long-term isolation. Increasing immersion in online grievance communities. Growing resentment toward social exclusion. The attack appeared less like spontaneous emotional collapse and more like a fantasy slowly hardening into action. That realization disturbed investigators profoundly because gradual radicalization often leaves fewer obvious intervention points. There had been no dramatic manifesto mailed to media outlets beforehand. No threatening messages sent directly to victims. Just a lonely man consuming resentment privately until violence felt meaningful. Public pressure on investigators remained enormous throughout this period. Canada had experienced mass violence before, but the Toronto van attack struck uniquely deep because of its randomness and visibility. Citizens demanded answers regarding prevention, warning signs, and online extremism. Politicians called for greater monitoring of dangerous digital communities. Women's advocacy groups highlighted misogyny and harassment often dismissed previously as mere internet culture. Mental health advocates warned against unfairly stigmatizing autism or social isolation. The case became a cultural battlefield where competing narratives collided constantly. Inside interrogation rooms, Minassian himself presented another challenge entirely. Investigators described him as oddly calm after arrest. Detached. Cooperative at times, yet emotionally flat. During interviews, he discussed online incel culture openly and acknowledged admiration for Elliot Rodger. But even there, his presentation felt strangely performative rather than passionately ideological. Some statements sounded rehearsed, as though he were imitating identities absorbed online instead of expressing deeply rooted personal conviction. Detectives trained in behavioral analysis noticed inconsistencies between the enormity of the violence and Minassian's effect. He rarely displayed visible remorse, but neither did he project the intense fanaticism associated with many ideological extremists. Instead, he often seemed emotionally disconnected from ordinary human responses altogether. That emotional detachment intensified debate among investigators and psychological experts. Was he coldly calculating, neurologically impaired, emotionally underdeveloped, or some combination impossible to separate cleanly? The deeper the investigation moved into psychology, the murkier the answers became. Forensic psychiatrists eventually entered the case heavily. They evaluated Minassian's cognitive functioning, emotional processing, moral awareness, and understanding of consequences. Court proceedings would later revolve significantly around criminal responsibility and intent. But even before trial, investigators recognized the defense strategy forming around developmental disorder and diminished emotional comprehension. Prosecutors prepared aggressively to counter that narrative by emphasizing planning behavior. Renting the van. Choosing a crowded route. Posting ideological messages beforehand. Accelerating deliberately toward pedestrians repeatedly. Fleeing after the attack. These actions suggested awareness and intentionality incompatible with complete incapacity. Yet emotionally, many detectives still struggled privately with a haunting question. How does someone become so detached from humanity that mass murder feels meaningful? No single answer satisfied completely. Online radicalization mattered. Isolation mattered. Neurological differences perhaps mattered too. But reducing the attack to one cause felt dishonest. Human violence often emerges from multiple interacting fractures rather than one simple origin point. Meanwhile, investigators continued tracing every minute of April 23 itself. Surveillance footage from dozens of cameras was synchronized into detailed timelines. Analysts tracked the van's movements frame by frame. Witness statements were cross-referenced against video evidence meticulously. Prosecutors needed airtight reconstruction because the case would become internationally scrutinized. Every detail mattered. Which pedestrians had time to react? How the van maneuvered? Whether Minassian swerved intentionally toward individuals? The evidence overwhelmingly confirmed deliberate targeting. Yet reviewing that footage repeatedly took emotional tolls on investigators. Some analysts reportedly requested rotation away from the case temporarily after prolonged exposure to graphic video. One detective later admitted certain images remained impossible to forget, particularly victims who appeared entirely unaware until the final instant before impact. Outside investigative circles, another phenomenon emerged online. Portions of extremist communities celebrated the attack. That reaction horrified authorities. Certain anonymous users referred to Minassian as a hero or saint, echoing language previously used regarding Elliot Rodger. The glorification reinforced fears that internet radicalization could inspire copycat violence. Law enforcement agencies internationally began paying closer attention to misogynistic extremist spaces previously dismissed as fringe internet toxicity rather than genuine security threats. The Toronto attack forced re-evaluation. Hatred incubated online could translate into real-world mass casualties even without formal organizations or political manifestos. By late 2018, investigators had assembled a clearer factual picture of the crime itself. But psychologically, the case remained deeply unsettling precisely because of its ambiguity. Alec Minassian was neither fully incomprehensible monster nor sympathetic victim of circumstance. He existed somewhere more disturbing, an isolated human being who absorbed toxic ideas until violence became purpose. That complexity frustrated simplistic narratives. Some people wanted pure evil. Others searched for mental illness explanations that removed moral responsibility. But the investigation increasingly suggested a more uncomfortable truth. Minassian understood enough to plan mass murder deliberately. He also appeared profoundly emotionally damaged and socially disconnected. Those realities could coexist simultaneously. And somewhere within that collision between grievance, ideology, isolation, and distorted identity, 11 innocent people lost their lives on a Toronto sidewalk beneath ordinary spring sunlight. For nearly 2 years after the attack, the Toronto van case remained suspended between overwhelming evidence and unanswered psychological questions. The public believed they already understood what happened. A lonely young man consumed by misogynistic online extremism rented a van and turned a crowded sidewalk into a killing field. On the surface, the narrative appeared horrifyingly straightforward. But inside courtrooms, psychiatric evaluations, and prosecutorial strategy meetings, the case was evolving into something far more complicated. Investigators had established the physical facts beyond dispute. Surveillance footage documented the attack in brutal detail. Witnesses confirmed intentional targeting. Digital evidence connected Alec Minassian to extremist incel ideology. Yet one question still hovered over the case like a storm cloud: was he fully criminally responsible for what he did? That question would become the decisive battleground. And the breakthrough that reshaped the case did not arrive through hidden DNA evidence or a surprise eyewitness. It emerged from understanding Minassian's own mind. In early interrogations following his arrest, detectives noticed something deeply unusual about the way Minassian described the massacre. There was no trembling emotion, no visible rage, no coherent political philosophy. He often spoke with an eerie calmness that felt emotionally disconnected from the scale of suffering he caused. At times he sounded almost analytical, discussing online incel culture and Elliot Rodger as though reciting information from internet forums rather than reflecting on mass murder. That emotional flatness initially disturbed investigators because it made him appear terrifyingly detached. But as forensic psychiatrists spent more time evaluating him, another interpretation began emerging. Perhaps Minassian's emotional disconnect did not stem purely from psychopathy or ideological hatred. Perhaps years of neurological and social impairment had fundamentally distorted the way he processed human relationships and consequences. The defense seized on that possibility immediately. Their strategy centered around autism spectrum disorder and impaired emotional reasoning. They argued that Minassian's developmental condition severely affected his social understanding, empathy, and ability to interpret interpersonal rejection. According to the defense, he became trapped in distorted online communities because he lacked the emotional tools necessary to navigate ordinary human connection. Over time, fantasy and reality blurred together until violence felt abstract rather than morally catastrophic. Prosecutors strongly rejected that framing. They argued that autism does not erase moral understanding or excuse mass murder. More importantly, they pointed toward evidence of deliberate planning. Minassian rented the van intentionally. He selected a crowded location strategically. He accelerated toward pedestrians repeatedly. He referenced ideological motivations beforehand. These were not random or impulsive actions. They reflected awareness and intent. Yet behind closed doors, both sides recognized the case carried enormous psychological complexity. Unlike many violent offenders driven by obvious rage or domination, Minassian remained strangely difficult to categorize. That uncertainty became even more significant when investigators uncovered the depth of his online immersion. Digital forensic analysts reconstructed years of internet activity across forums, social media accounts, and message boards linked to incel ideology. What they discovered painted a portrait of escalating radicalization shaped by loneliness and resentment. Minassian spent enormous amounts of time consuming content centered around social humiliation, sexual rejection, and misogynistic grievance. But the breakthrough came when analysts noticed how performative much of his behavior appeared. He often echoed language popular within extremist communities rather than expressing original ideological thought. Certain phrases mirrored internet memes almost word for word. His admiration for Elliot Rodger resembled idol worship filtered through online subculture rather than deeply coherent political conviction. Investigators began to suspect something profoundly disturbing. Minassian may have constructed his identity almost entirely from digital influence because he lacked a stable sense of self offline. That realization shifted the investigation dramatically. Instead of viewing him solely as a traditional ideological extremist, experts increasingly saw a psychologically vulnerable individual absorbing identity from toxic online spaces that rewarded grievance and violence. The distinction mattered enormously because it revealed how modern radicalization can evolve not through organized recruitment but through emotional dependency on internet communities. Minassian was not leading movements. He was searching desperately for belonging. And he found it in spaces poisoned by hatred. During psychiatric evaluations, another critical pattern emerged. Minassian appeared obsessed with social status and recognition. Throughout his life, he struggled profoundly with invisibility and humiliation. Former classmates remembered awkward attempts to fit in that often ended in embarrassment. Social rejection accumulated over years until resentment hardened into identity. But rather than processing that pain through healthy relationships or self-reflection, he retreated deeper into online worlds where anger felt validated. The incel community offered him a framework that transformed personal loneliness into collective victimhood. Suddenly his failures were no longer individual struggles. They became evidence of a supposedly corrupt social system designed to exclude men like him. That ideological framework became psychologically seductive because it converted shame into blame. Yet prosecutors uncovered evidence suggesting Minassian understood the moral gravity of violence far more clearly than the defense claimed. One major breakthrough came through analysis of his own statements after arrest. During police interviews, he openly described wanting notoriety. He referenced previous mass killers almost competitively, discussing casualty counts and media attention. Investigators realized the attack was not only revenge fantasy. It was also an attempt to matter. To force a world that ignored him to finally pay attention. That motive aligned closely with patterns seen in many lone actor mass killings. Violence becomes a shortcut to significance for individuals who feel powerless or invisible. The attack transformed Minassian instantly from socially isolated nobody into an internationally recognized figure. Prosecutors argued this demonstrated conscious calculation rather than emotional confusion. He understood society condemned murder. He committed it anyway because infamy itself became desirable. Another turning point emerged through detailed reconstruction of the attack route itself. Forensic analysis revealed Minassian repeatedly adjusted the van's trajectory toward pedestrians even when open roadway space existed. This evidence destroyed any lingering suggestion of panic or diminished situational awareness. The attack required sustained decision-making over nearly 2 kilometers. He maneuvered intentionally, corrected direction repeatedly, continued despite collisions and visible chaos. Those details became crucial because they showed prolonged conscious engagement rather than impulsive emotional collapse. The prosecution's psychological experts emphasized exactly that point. Whatever developmental impairments Minassian possessed, he demonstrated organized, goal-directed behavior throughout the massacre. Yet perhaps the most chilling breakthrough came from understanding how ordinary the pathway toward violence had appeared beforehand. Investigators discovered no secret terror network, no elaborate operational planning, no weapons stockpile, no hidden conspiracy. Instead, the ingredients were painfully modern and disturbingly accessible: loneliness, online radicalization, resentment, identity crisis, social isolation, and a rented vehicle. Security experts began re-evaluating threat assessment models entirely because the Toronto attack exposed how difficult lone-actor violence can be to predict. Minassian had not displayed the traditional warning signs associated with organized extremism. He drifted quietly through society while his worldview deteriorated privately online. This realization sent shockwaves through law enforcement and psychological research communities internationally. The case became a landmark example of how internet ecosystems can accelerate emotional instability into real-world violence without direct command structures or formal recruitment. Public understanding of incel ideology also shifted dramatically during this period. Before the attack, many dismissed such forums as pathetic internet subcultures filled with angry but harmless men. The Toronto massacre shattered that perception permanently. Researchers uncovered extensive networks where misogyny, entitlement, and violence were normalized constantly. Some users openly celebrated rape or mass murder fantasies. Others encouraged suicidal despair mixed with revenge rhetoric. Investigators realized these communities functioned similarly to extremist echo chambers seen in other forms of radicalization. Emotional pain became weaponized through constant reinforcement. Isolation deepened. Empathy eroded. Violence slowly transformed from unthinkable into imaginable. Meanwhile, survivors and victims' families continued living through consequences that no courtroom analysis could fully capture. Some injured victims remained in rehabilitation years later. Others struggled psychologically with ordinary activities like crossing streets or hearing engines accelerate nearby. Families attended memorial events while simultaneously preparing emotionally for eventual trial proceedings. Every new detail released publicly reopened wounds. Especially painful were revelations regarding Minassian's apparent emotional detachment afterward. Many relatives struggled to comprehend how someone could cause such devastation and appear almost intellectually curious rather than remorseful. Yet the emotional complexity surrounding Minassian himself continued frustrating simplistic narratives. Certain psychiatric evaluations suggested he experienced genuine difficulty understanding emotional reciprocity and human intimacy. He appeared profoundly stunted socially and emotionally, almost adolescent in some aspects despite his age. But prosecutors insisted emotional immaturity cannot erase accountability. Millions of socially isolated individuals experience rejection without murdering strangers. That argument became central to the case's moral framework. The court ultimately needed to decide whether Minassian's neurological condition diminished responsibility or merely explained part of his psychological development. As trial preparations intensified, one final breakthrough strengthened the prosecution decisively. Investigators demonstrated that Minassian specifically researched mass killings and media coverage beforehand. He understood the social impact such attacks generated. He anticipated attention and cultural shock. This evidence suggested awareness not only of physical consequences but symbolic ones. He wanted the attack interpreted as meaningful. That understanding undermined defense arguments portraying him as incapable of grasping societal morality. The prosecution argued successfully that Minassian's planning reflected calculated intent shaped by extremist ideology and personal grievance rather than inability to distinguish right from wrong. By the time the case approached court, the investigation had evolved beyond solving a crime. It became a disturbing examination of modern alienation itself. Investigators no longer saw the Toronto van attack as simply one man snapping suddenly. Instead, it represented the convergence of multiple fractures in contemporary society: online radicalization, social isolation, misogyny, identity collapse, and the psychological consequences of living increasingly disconnected lives mediated through digital echo chambers. Alek Minassian became both deeply individual and frighteningly symbolic at the same time. He was responsible for his own choices. Yet his pathway toward violence reflected broader systems capable of reshaping vulnerable minds in isolation. And perhaps that was the investigation's most terrifying breakthrough of all. The realization that the next potential attacker might not look outwardly dangerous either. He might simply be another lonely figure behind a glowing screen, slowly learning to replace human connection with resentment until violence begins to feel like purpose. When the trial of Alek Minassian finally began, nearly 3 years had passed since the white van climbed the curb on Yonge Street. Toronto had continued moving forward outwardly. Traffic returned. Office towers filled again each morning. Restaurants reopened. New construction projects reshaped parts of the city skyline. But beneath that appearance of normality, the wounds remained painfully alive for survivors and victims' families. Some still avoided Yonge Street entirely. Others crossed sidewalks with instinctive fear whenever large vehicles approached. The attack had altered the psychological rhythm of the city itself. And now, inside a quiet courtroom beneath sterile lights, the man responsible sat facing the legal system that would decide how history remembered him. Unlike many murder trials driven by uncertainty over guilt, this case centered almost entirely on responsibility and intent. There was no dispute that Alek Minassian committed the attack. Surveillance footage, witness testimony, forensic evidence, and his own statements made denial impossible. The courtroom would instead wrestle with a more difficult and emotionally charged question: did Minassian fully understand the moral consequences of his actions when he murdered 11 people and injured many others? The answer would determine whether he was legally criminally responsible or whether his autism spectrum disorder significantly impaired his judgment. The emotional atmosphere surrounding the proceedings felt heavy from the very first day. Families of the victims entered the courtroom carrying photographs and memories of people stolen from them violently. Some survivors attended despite ongoing trauma because they needed to witness accountability personally. Reporters crowded outside each morning, microphones ready, cameras fixed toward courthouse doors. International media followed the trial closely because the Toronto van attack had become far more than a Canadian criminal case. It represented a global confrontation with online extremism, misogyny, and the frightening evolution of lone actor violence in the digital age. Alek Minassian himself appeared emotionally distant throughout much of the proceedings. Thin, pale, often expressionless. Observers frequently commented on his unusual effect, the strange calmness that seemed disconnected from the horror surrounding him. At times he answered questions with awkward precision, almost robotic in tone. Other moments revealed flashes of immaturity that made him appear emotionally younger than his actual age. This contradiction became central to the defense strategy. His lawyers argued that Minassian's autism spectrum disorder severely limited his emotional reasoning and social understanding. They emphasized years of developmental struggles, communication difficulties, and inability to form meaningful relationships. According to the defense, he had become psychologically trapped inside distorted online communities because he lacked the emotional capacity to process rejection and loneliness in healthy ways. Expert witnesses called by the defense described autism not simply as social awkwardness, but as a condition that can profoundly affect emotional interpretation and interpersonal understanding. They argued Minassian's worldview became dangerously warped over time because he misunderstood human relationships fundamentally. In their view, his immersion in incel ideology represented not calculated hatred alone but emotional confusion amplified through internet radicalization. Some testimony portrayed him almost as a psychologically stunted individual desperate for identity and belonging. The prosecution responded forcefully. Crown attorneys acknowledged Minassian's developmental challenges but insisted those struggles did not erase moral awareness. Their case focused relentlessly on planning, intent, and conscious decision-making. They reconstructed the attack step by step before the court. Renting the van deliberately. choosing a crowded pedestrian corridor intentionally, accelerating toward victims repeatedly, steering into people even when open roadway space existed, posting ideological messages beforehand praising Elliot Rodger and referencing the Incel Rebellion. These actions, prosecutors argued, demonstrated clear understanding of both right and wrong. One of the most emotionally devastating moments during the trial came when surveillance footage from the attack was shown in court. Families sat silently while screens displayed the white Chevrolet Express mounting the sidewalk and tearing through pedestrians. Some relatives lowered their heads, unable to watch. Others stared forward through tears because looking away somehow felt impossible. The footage carried brutal clarity. Victims walking peacefully seconds before impact. Bodies thrown violently across concrete. Chaos spreading through intersections beneath ordinary daylight. Prosecutors used the footage strategically to emphasize intentionality. This was not confusion. Not panic. Not accidental loss of control. The van moved with purpose. Witness testimony reinforced that reality painfully. Survivors described hearing the engine accelerating aggressively behind them. One witness recounted seeing pedestrians launched into the air. Another remembered making eye contact with victims moments before impact. Several survivors spoke about the permanent psychological damage left behind. Nightmares. Panic attacks. Fear of crossing streets. The inability to hear engines rev without reliving the attack mentally. Their voices transformed abstract legal arguments into human suffering impossible to ignore. Families of the victims also delivered emotionally devastating testimony. They spoke not only about death itself but about absence. Empty chairs at dinner tables. Birthdays now marked by grief. Voicemails saved because hearing a loved one's voice became precious beyond words. Parents described futures erased completely. Children growing up without mothers. Elderly spouses forced into loneliness after decades together. These moments pierced through the courtroom's legal structure and reminded everyone present that the case involved real human lives destroyed permanently. Meanwhile, prosecutors introduced evidence regarding Minassian's online activity and ideological influences. The court examined his fascination with Elliot Rodger and incel subculture in disturbing detail. Experts explained how certain online communities glorified misogyny, resentment, and mass violence. Messages recovered from digital records revealed admiration for previous killers and obsession with social status. Prosecutors argued that Minassian embraced these ideas consciously because they transformed his personal failures into ideological grievance. He did not merely stumble into extremism accidentally. He adopted it because it gave meaning to resentment. Yet the defense continued emphasizing emotional impairment rather than ideological fanaticism. Their experts argued Minassian often repeated internet rhetoric without fully comprehending its social implications. He absorbed identities and language from online spaces because he lacked a stable sense of self offline. In many ways, the defense portrayed him less as a calculating extremist mastermind and more as a deeply damaged individual vulnerable to manipulation by toxic digital culture. This psychological ambiguity made the trial unusually complex. The court was not deciding whether Minassian committed murder. It was deciding how human responsibility functions when neurological impairment, emotional immaturity, and extremist ideology collide. One particularly significant moment occurred during discussion of the confrontation with Officer Ken Lam after the attack. Prosecutors highlighted Minassian's attempt at suicide by cop, arguing it showed awareness of wrongdoing and anticipation of consequences. He knew police would likely kill him because he understood society viewed his actions as monstrous. The defense countered that his behavior reflected emotional confusion and distorted thinking rather than clear moral reasoning. But prosecutors returned repeatedly to the same core argument. Despite developmental challenges, Minassian demonstrated organized planning and conscious intent throughout the attack. Another powerful turning point came through psychiatric testimony regarding empathy and moral understanding. Experts debated whether Minassian truly grasped the emotional reality of his victims. Some defense witnesses suggested he struggled profoundly with emotional reciprocity and social cognition. Prosecutors challenged this interpretation aggressively, arguing that difficulty processing emotions does not eliminate awareness that killing innocent people is wrong. This distinction became central to the court's reasoning eventually. Autism may explain aspects of behavior, but explanation is not absolution. Outside the courthouse, public debate intensified throughout the trial. Some advocacy groups worried the defense strategy risked unfairly stigmatizing autistic individuals by associating developmental disorders with mass violence. Mental health experts emphasized repeatedly that autism itself does not cause criminality. Others focused on misogyny and online radicalization, arguing the attack represented extremist violence regardless of neurological factors. The case became a national conversation about responsibility, alienation, masculinity, internet culture, and the limits of criminal psychology. For survivors and victims' families, however, those broader debates often felt secondary to grief itself. They wanted accountability. They wanted the court to recognize that deliberate choices had destroyed innocent lives. In March 2021, Justice Anne Mallory delivered the verdict after months of testimony and legal argument. The courtroom fell silent as she explained her reasoning carefully. She acknowledged Manassian's autism spectrum disorder and social impairments but concluded they did not prevent him from understanding the moral wrongness of his actions. He knew killing people was wrong. He knew society condemned murder. He planned the attack deliberately anyway. The court found him criminally responsible on all counts. 10 counts of first-degree murder. 16 counts of attempted murder. The verdict carried enormous emotional weight because it rejected the idea that neurological condition erased accountability. Justice Mallory emphasized that while Manassian struggled socially and emotionally, he still possessed the capacity to choose between right and wrong. The ruling became legally and culturally significant, shaping future discussions around criminal responsibility and developmental disorders. Yet for many families, no verdict could restore what had been taken. Sentencing followed later, extending the emotional ordeal once again. Crown prosecutors argued the scale and brutality of the attack justified the harshest punishment available under Canadian law. Defense attorneys urged consideration of Manassian's psychological limitations. Survivors and relatives delivered victim impact statements describing years of trauma and grief. Some spoke directly toward Manassian seated only meters away. Others could barely finish sentences through tears. One recurring theme echoed through many statements: ordinary life had become permanently divided into before and after April 23, 2018. Eventually, the court sentenced Alec Manassian to life imprisonment without possibility of parole for 25 years. In Canada, where the death penalty no longer exists, it represented one of the harshest punishments available. Yet even after sentencing, emotional resolution remained elusive. Courtrooms can establish legal accountability, but they cannot answer deeper existential questions haunting tragedies like this. Why did resentment become violence? Could intervention have prevented radicalization earlier? How many other isolated individuals drift silently through online spaces consuming hatred? And perhaps most disturbingly, how does modern society confront forms of extremism born not from organized political movements alone but from loneliness, humiliation, and digital alienation? As Manassian was led away after sentencing, the courtroom atmosphere remained subdued rather than triumphant. Justice rarely feels victorious in cases involving irreversible mass death. There is relief sometimes. Closure in limited forms. But mostly there is absence. 11 people never returned home from an ordinary spring afternoon in Toronto. Survivors carried invisible wounds into the future. Families rebuilt lives around grief rather than healing from it completely. And sitting at the center of it all remained a man who once felt invisible enough to believe mass murder could finally make the world notice him. Years after the attack, Yonge Street still looks ordinary to most people passing through Toronto. Traffic hums through intersections. Office workers hurry toward subway entrances with coffee cups in hand. Couples wait at crosswalks staring into their phones. Delivery vans idle beside curbs while cyclists weave through crowded lanes. The city moves forward because cities always do. Concrete gets cleaned. Glass gets replaced. News coverage fades. New tragedies eventually arrive to dominate headlines. But beneath the surface of ordinary movement, certain places carry invisible scars that never fully disappear. For survivors, for witnesses, for families who lost someone that afternoon in April 2018, Yonge Street no longer exists as just another road. It became a dividing line between two versions of life, before the van climbed the curb and after. In the years following the trial, Toronto attempted to process what the attack truly meant. Not only legally, but emotionally and culturally. Memorial ceremonies continued annually. Flowers appeared each April near the sites where victims died. Some survivors attended quietly, standing beside strangers who now shared permanent connection through trauma. Families carried framed photographs beneath cloudy spring skies while reporters kept respectful distance. Names were read aloud slowly. Candles flickered in cold wind. And each year, people asked the same question in different ways. How could something like this happen here? That question matters because Toronto built much of its identity around safety and coexistence. The city saw itself as multicultural, stable, tolerant, insulated from the kinds of public violence associated with other parts of the world. The attack shattered that psychological certainty. It forced Canadians to confront an uncomfortable reality modern societies everywhere now face. Danger does not always arrive wearing recognizable uniforms or carrying political banners. Sometimes it develops silently inside isolated minds connected more deeply to internet subcultures than to real human relationships. Alek Minassian became one of the most disturbing examples of a new kind of extremism shaped not through organized cells or militant training camps, but through loneliness amplified online until hatred felt meaningful. Yet reducing the story solely to ideology risks missing something equally important. The Toronto van attack was also a story about invisibility. About what happens when emotional isolation hardens over years without intervention, connection, or purpose. That does not excuse violence. Nothing excuses what happened on Yonge Street. Millions of lonely people never harm anyone. Millions experience rejection without turning bitterness into murder. Responsibility for the attack belongs entirely to the man who chose to weaponize his resentment against strangers. But understanding is different from excusing. And understanding requires confronting difficult truths about the emotional conditions that modern society often ignores until catastrophe erupts. One of the most haunting aspects of the case remains how ordinary Minassian appeared before the attack. He did not resemble cinematic villains. He was socially awkward, emotionally detached, isolated, but not visibly monstrous. Former classmates remembered discomfort around him, not terror. Co-workers saw awkwardness, not obvious danger. That ambiguity unsettles people because it destroys comforting assumptions about evil. We want violence to announce itself clearly beforehand. We want certainty that monsters can be identified easily. But real-world mass violence often grows quietly beneath surfaces that appear merely lonely, strange, or socially disconnected. The internet accelerated that danger dramatically. Before the digital age, isolated individuals often remained limited by geography and circumstance. Now resentment can instantly find reinforcement online. Algorithms feed grievance. Anonymous forums reward extremism with attention. Communities built around bitterness can transform personal pain into collective ideology within months or even weeks. Incel culture became one of the clearest examples of this transformation. What began partially as discussions about loneliness and rejection evolved in some spaces into misogynistic extremism celebrating violence and dehumanization. The Toronto attack forced governments, researchers, and law enforcement agencies worldwide to recognize those communities as potential security threats rather than harmless internet toxicity. But even now, years later, society still struggles with how to respond effectively. Censorship alone rarely solves emotional alienation. Surveillance cannot replace human connection. And modern loneliness itself has become widespread far beyond extremist spaces. Many people move through crowded cities feeling profoundly unseen. Relationships increasingly occur through screens. Young men especially often grow up emotionally isolated, lacking healthy models for vulnerability, rejection, and identity formation. Some retreat inward quietly. Others search online for explanations that convert insecurity into blame. Most never become violent. But a tiny number eventually cross terrifying lines. The Toronto van attack revealed what can happen when grievance, entitlement, emotional immaturity, and extremist reinforcement combine inside someone desperate to matter. For survivors, however, those broader societal questions often feel distant compared to daily reality. Trauma does not disappear simply because years pass. Some survivors still avoid crowded sidewalks or panic when vehicles accelerate unexpectedly nearby. Certain sounds remain triggering: engines revving, tires striking curbs, sudden screaming in public. PTSD reshapes the nervous system itself. Ordinary environments stop feeling entirely safe. One survivor later described constantly calculating escape routes while walking downtown, even years after the attack. Another admitted they still look directly into drivers' faces at intersections, searching unconsciously for signs of danger. Trauma changes perception permanently for many people. Families of the victims carry different forms of pain. Some continue advocacy work related to mental health, public safety, or anti-violence initiatives. Others prefer privacy, grieving quietly away from cameras and public memorials. But all of them live with absence that cannot be repaired through court verdicts or prison sentences. A mother still missing her daughter's voice. A child growing older without a parent. Elderly spouses eating dinner alone after decades together. True crime stories often focus heavily on perpetrators because violence attracts attention. Yet the deepest truth of the Toronto attack lies not in Alek Minassian's resentment, but in the ordinary humanity of the people he killed. Anne-Marie D'Amico helping vulnerable people throughout her life. Renuka Amarasing raising her son after immigrating from Sri Lanka. Dorothy Sewell carrying nearly a century of memories before dying on a city sidewalk. Their lives mattered long before the attack happened. And perhaps one of the greatest moral failures in public fascination with violence is how easily victims become secondary to the killers who harmed them. The Toronto case also reshaped conversations around masculinity and emotional health. Many experts pointed afterward toward cultural expectations that leave some men emotionally unequipped to handle rejection, loneliness, or vulnerability. Certain online communities exploit that pain by offering simplistic narratives built around blame and entitlement. Women become scapegoats. Society becomes enemy. Violence becomes fantasy. The danger emerges not simply from misogyny itself, but from emotional ecosystems where empathy erodes completely. Minassian did not wake up one morning transformed instantly into a killer. His worldview deteriorated gradually through years of isolation and reinforcement. That process should concern everyone because similar patterns appear repeatedly across many forms of extremism. Alienated individuals searching for identity often become vulnerable to ideologies that offer belonging through hatred. Another uncomfortable lesson from the attack involves the fragility of ordinary life. Human beings move through daily routines assuming continuity. We plan dinners, answer emails, wait for buses, argue about trivial things, believing tomorrow will resemble today. Mass violence ruptures that illusion brutally. The victims on Yonge Street were not soldiers or public figures. They were people running errands, walking during lunch breaks, heading toward appointments. Ordinary life ended for them in seconds. That randomness creates a particular existential horror because it reminds everyone how thin the boundary between normality and catastrophe truly is. Yet despite everything, there were also moments after the attack that revealed another side of humanity. Strangers pulling injured people from danger. Restaurant workers rushing outside with medical supplies. Witnesses comforting survivors covered in blood despite overwhelming fear. Officer Ken Lam refusing to escalate violence during the arrest even after witnessing unimaginable destruction. Communities gathering afterward across religious, cultural, and political lines to mourn together. Violence often exposes darkness within humanity, but tragedy can also reveal compassion with startling clarity. Toronto itself changed after April 23, 2018, though perhaps not always visibly. Conversations around online extremism became more urgent. Law enforcement agencies began monitoring misogynistic radicalization more seriously. Mental health discussions expanded. Urban security planning evolved in some public spaces. But emotionally, the city also became more aware of vulnerability. The attack stripped away illusions that modern life guarantees safety simply because society appears stable on the surface. In the end, the Toronto van attack remains difficult to categorize neatly because it sits at the intersection of so many modern fears: misogyny, loneliness, internet radicalization, mental health, public violence, masculinity, alienation, extremism without organizations, hatred incubated in private rooms behind glowing screens. It forces uncomfortable reflection because no single explanation fully contains it. Alek Minassian was responsible for his actions completely. Yet he also emerged from broader social conditions increasingly recognizable across the modern world. And perhaps that is the final unsettling truth beneath this story. The danger was never only one man in a rented van. The danger is what happens when human beings lose connection deeply enough that resentment begins to feel more real than empathy. When humiliation becomes identity. When anonymous digital spaces replace authentic relationships. When violence starts looking like significance to someone who believes they are invisible. On April 23, 2018, 11 innocent people lost their lives because one isolated man decided strangers should suffer for his pain. Toronto will carry that memory forever. But memory alone is not enough. The real challenge lies in recognizing the warning signs of emotional collapse before grievance transforms into ideology and ideology transforms into bloodshed on an ordinary city street beneath spring sunlight.